So I'm Ken Sag, Director of the Center of Outcomes Effectiveness Research and Education. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you and our speakers today to our 8th annual Method Symposia. This is an event that we always look forward to each year to bring in some visitors to hear about some topics, and it's been really helpful over the years to get feedback from all of you, and at the end of this we'll want to solicit your input on future topics. I want to first acknowledge our sponsors, which include our Outcome Center and several other entities, including the School of Medicine AMC 21 initiative. And we've been doing this for a few years. Here are some of the topics that we've covered. You can see that in 2014 we actually had a similar topic on health systems interventions, and it was so popular we decided to focus on that again this year with some really terrific speakers and some very timely topics. And so I think as we look at what we're going to hear about today and get it introduced to these different topics, it's important to put it into the context of the learning healthcare system. This is what the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, has coined as the opportunity for a routine clinical encounter to generate research-grade data. And how can we turn our healthcare systems into research environments? And I find this particularly interesting, that there's actually some ethical underpinnings for this. Ruth Cass and her colleagues at Hopkins have suggested that both for healthcare professionals and institutions we have a moral priority, and it's a similar obligation for our patients to participate based on the principle of common good. So the obligation to address unjust inequalities, the learning healthcare system must decrease inequalities in an evidence-based way for clinical decision making. So as we hear the talks today, we want to think about this framework and consider how we can actualize some of this within our own healthcare system. So if you haven't seen already, we've got a very abundant supply of food and coffee. Please help yourself. We'll take a break in the middle, but if you need to get up, there's refreshments around the corner. CME is available for those that are interested. As usual, please silence your phones. Restrooms around the corner. And at the conclusion of this, the presentations will be available for you online. So we'll put up the agenda and just show you what we're going to do today. We'll start off with Adrian Hernandez, followed by Paul Harris, Amy Kilborn from the University of Michigan, and then our very own Mike Mugavero. We'll talk about healthcare access, and we'll finish up a little bit before noon. And we should have time at the end of each speaker's presentation for plenty of discussion. Great, so without further ado, let me introduce Jeff Curtis, who will welcome our first speaker.
Well, good morning. It's certainly a delight to be with you and to introduce Dr. Adrian Hernandez. So Dr. Hernandez is a cardiologist at Duke, and he's the Associate Director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute, really one of the preeminent clinical research centers in the United States, focused not just on cardiology, but on a lot of other endeavors across different disciplines. He leads a number of different collaboratories and large networks. We're going to hear, I think, about at least one of those today, including the NIH collaboratory, as well as Cornette, one of the major investments that the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute has made, really trying to improve population health, quality improvement, to do interventional and observational studies to improve the health of patients and really address questions that both clinicians and patients would highly value. So with that, thank you very much for being able to visit us today.
All right, great, thanks. Is this working?
It is. I'm working online on the recording.
Okay, all right, just want to make sure, since I know you were doing some technical changes here. So thanks for having me. I do have a few disclosures. One is my mother's family's from Alabama. And so I appreciate boiled peanuts. I spent many summers here, my grandparents, in a place called Abbeville, Alabama. Anyone know where Abbeville is? Okay. All right, well, we have a winner. Congratulations. So Abbeville is in Henry County, which is just north of Dothan, Alabama. So I think people know where Dothan, Alabama. My guess is there have been people that have come all the way from Dothan to UAB for their care. and I'm pretty sure that my family members have actually come here. I know that for a fact here. So it's always great to be back in Alabama. Whenever I come here for anything, one of the questions that I get from my mother and relatives is that, am I actually going to come here permanently? But anyway, it's always fun to come visit. And so for the next 40 minutes, I want to share with you what we've been working on over the last few years regarding the Cornette, and hopefully get you all excited about how you could actually join. So in different ways, you're part of it in some ways, but we're actually trying to create a pathway for this to be really a national evidence generation system that multiple people can join, multiple systems and organizations can join. These are actually my real disclosures. We work with a lot of different people. And so over the next 40 minutes, I just want to go through a few key topics. One is the why. Why was this actually done? The how was it actually translating the vision to reality, and then the what of what's actually happening now, and then actually show what the doing is, meaning actually doing research. So instead of being a slideshow, actually showing that we're actually starting to generate answers, and then also end with what's next. So, but first, I just want to share a story, and it's quite interesting. So I know there are a lot of people here who dedicated health services research. When I was kind of growing up in that kind of training, and then trying to explain to my parents, that I wasn't going to go back home to Port Arthur, Texas, and practice with my father, that I had this idea that I actually wanted to do research. They didn't understand what that meant. But eventually they got to, okay, well, this sounds like a potentially good idea, but are you going to be able to care for you and your family? And then after years of training, I got this note from my mother that she saw a story in the local paper. And it turned out that the local paper had picked up an article that we had published in JAMA about ventricular assist devices, and essentially at the time, ventricular assist devices were used for heart failure, but the technology was still evolving. And so based on the outcomes there for these big devices, then they weren't what we wanted, and they certainly weren't as inexpensive as everyone would want. And the basic story was that we have more work to do, and we need to continue to measure this, and actually in order to share with the community where we want to go and how to get there, but also showing that we're not there yet on outcomes, and we're not there yet on cost. And she had been diagnosed with coronary disease, and essentially she asked me if I knew what I was doing. That she had early coronary disease, that she actually may need one of these devices, that she understood from the news and the newspapers that these were life-saving devices, and that my article, my manuscript was essentially threatening that. And so, and she had picked up the article as well in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And so I went through and explained to her, the quality improvement cycle, you got to share what you have there. And so anyway, we got over that. And then a few years later, she had moved to Durham because of 4 things. Initially, there were only 2. We had twin boys, and so she was helping those out. And so she'd get approached with research ideas because she's part of Duke Health System. And so occasionally she would get contacted. And then one day she asked, well, I got this approach for doing this study, and it's about aspirin dosing. And I understand that you guys don't know in cardiology at Duke how to dose aspirin. And so she's like, starts going through this with me, that how many years that she spent money on med school, how she supported me through residency in San Francisco, which was expensive, and I was not living within my means with the UCSF salary. And then I continued to go on to Duke and do all this time there and get extra training as well. And it was beyond her that we didn't even know the right dose of aspirin. And so anyway, kind of went through the process there. But her points on both those things were, she actually wants answers now. She actually expects that we would have known what we need to do for advancing treatment for heart failure and ventricular assist devices. That we actually would have a continuous process that would actually assess this, that wouldn't have to take so many years to develop it. And she was just shocked also that we didn't know answers to questions that have been therapies that have been around for decades. And she was shocked that with all the training that I had, that I didn't know the simplest answers. So anyway, I'll continue that story, but as we go along. But one of the things that came up in discussing this is that, well, here I asked her, well, here's your chance to help us answer this. And there's a study that I'll talk about later that you could join to help you and others actually find out what the right answer. The thing that she was really worried about was these little creatures here called grandsons. And so she does a lot with our 4 boys helping out after school. And she was worried about what she would be required to go and do for a study. That she was okay, like if it was convenient, that she didn't have to go into the hospital or a clinic very often. But she was really worried about like how could she do that. But then on the flip side, she wants to live a very long time because she does have a great time with her boys, and we also really depend on her. So fundamentally though, like she was, couldn't believe that it takes so long, to go from this type of device and over the years, and how we're not learning all the time. And then also like the simple questions of aspirin, that we're not continuously addressing those questions for her and others. Her expectation actually was that we're always learning. And so, but that's kind of fallen short. So, and that's the point you heard Ken just talking about, that there is this vision that's been laid out actually many years ago now, is how can you learn from each other every day? And actually as patients are walking through the health systems, how are we actually learning from them and sharing their experiences for others, so we're always better for the next group of patients. And this has really come up even bigger. This is something that Mike Lauer pointed out to me, who's head of extramural funding, is that several years ago, the Labor Department was looking at the biomedical R&D area and noted that this was a pretty important growth area. And so what they noted was actually these curves going up here, that the mean total grant cost per patient was going up. And so the Labor Department was essentially looking at it as a good thing, that this is going to be a growing labor pool, and that would be important. Well, actually, it's the opposite. It actually means that we're like completely inefficient. That like, compared to the biomedical R&D price index, it's taken more and more to get the same thing out. And so that's a problem. And so when you see NIH saying that like they want essentially, they're not going to take this on anymore in terms of allowing this to continue, and you see that across industry, something has to change. And the last few weeks have been, the NIH's budget's been in the news. It's pretty incredible that we are arguing about our future in terms of the national investment that has really allowed the U.S. to lead in many ways, not only economically, but also in terms of innovations for the world and locally. And the NIH budget has been flat. I've asked different people around how they feel in terms of are they overflowing with NIH dollars, and you always get the same answer, which is chuckles and no. And that's reflected here. And even though we're on a personal mission about health services research, that's something that can have the immediate impact right now, that we actually don't invest like we should. If this was a different organization, you would do that. But part of the issue is how do we actually get results? And so, in people who are oriented to quality improvement, that's really clear to everyone. Well, now funders are actually getting big pressure on doing that. A couple of outsiders have noted that, well, shouldn't we turn the scientific method on ourselves? Actually, how do we actually measure the return on investment for the dollars that are spent at NIH? How do institutions do that as well? This book came out a few weeks ago, Rigor Mortis, and it actually is very interesting in highlighting how systematically we have issues, that the incentive structure is so much aligned towards individual success. You're trying to create results that are hard to reproduce. And that's from fundamental basic science to the full spectrum. And so an example is two cases where two industry leaders actually went to replicate fundamental experiments that led to essentially hundreds of millions or even several billion dollars for drug development. And they couldn't replicate the fundamental experiments more than 15% of the time. And so I think this is why there's huge attention in getting results now and truly learning as we go. And so in part, these are reasons why PCORI in 2012 actually brought a group of various stakeholders and said, what can we do to change things? What would be the national investment to make things different? And the various stakeholders basically said our research system is fractured, and it's parallel to healthcare, and it's as fractured as healthcare. And so the answers that we get take too long. They don't always answer the questions that people want, and meaning all people, patients, clinicians, health systems, regulators, payers, and even when we do, it's really expensive. The cost per participant in a clinical trial is incredible, and the time it takes to get answers is also unbelievable. So now transitioning to, well, how do you translate what the problems are into solving it? But Cornette was created for this, and essentially the vision was, how to bring together large organizations, people, and health systems to have a national system that would enhance clinical research with quality and efficiency, and really have a mission to enable people, meaning all people, as I said, to have informed healthcare decisions through clinical research that was relevant. And that mission has really been focused on developing a functional research network that engages people throughout, that creates an infrastructure that's reusable, tools and approaches and policies and practices that can be used, and also iterate over time, evolve as a health system and healthcare changes, and evolve as explosion of new techniques, new approaches, new methods around data science evolve. And then also leverage the many data silos that exist, and also protect privacy that people want to make sure have. And also how to ensure that you have essentially a trusting environment that people can join and contribute and actually do everyone else's research. That's part of the theme for that book, Rigor Mortis, was that we've created a system and incentive structure that people's individual success are actually often higher than the team's success or society's success. And so how do you create a different approach? So this is how it's organized right now. There are 20 people-powered research networks that are essentially groups of people organized around typically a theme of health or a condition, and 13 clinical data research networks, each of which have to have about 1 million people at least to get in here, and that becomes PCORNet. But really what PCORNet is this combination of researchers, patients, clinicians, health systems, and data that's armed to answer these questions. Since I know this is a method symposium, I'll spend a few minutes on the data part because people are interested on what's kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly around that, and how can you harness this. And I think everyone understands that underlying all this is, what's behind there and how will it change. And so Cornette is organized around a common data model that was created as an offshoot of what was FDA's Sentinel program for safety surveillance. But it basically pulls in areas that are routinely encountered in healthcare across these areas, but then also allows other areas to be added that may be of relevance for particular populations or different health systems. And for example, genomics is certainly a great interest. And also, how do you link different areas such as health plan data as well? And really, if you think about this and say you were given the task, someone came to you, let's say Donald Trump says like, hey, I'm not gonna get the wall built. Instead, I want to build a data system that is for all. He's a populist president. I think that would be a populist thing. And so he came to you and says, how do you get a research question at hundreds of institutions and get back results you trust? Those are themes that the Donald certainly would put forward. And you have two options that you come up with. You're on the edge of chaos, and so you brainstorm here. And option one, we'll write a description, we'll put it on email, we'll have everyone just do it locally and run against their own data. And so then they send the email results back to you. And the question is, do you trust it? Do you know if it's valid? Do you know if there's not a mistake somewhere? How do you know that? Or option two is actually create an algorithm that can run against a single common data model that's been curated, that's been characterized in some way, that you actually understand, that you have some fundamental trust of what that is. So I think that's been kind of a theme around a lot of different efforts, but really trying to take on option two and doing this in a way that happens. And then now I'm sure UAB is perfect in terms of how it's organized in healthcare. And I wish I could say that Duke is perfect, but we have this neighbor called UNC, and we always say that we're perfect in terms of everything that we do, except when we get humbled in basketball, like this year, and then also occasionally in healthcare, when we realize that it's complex. As Donald Trump has said, who would have thought that healthcare is complex? And one of the challenges is that, there is data everywhere, and the density and heterogeneity of data is incredible. And so, how can you harness it? Now, you could take, many years to try to, pull all this together, or you could start with a basic foundation that can grow as you learn. And so that's been really the approach here. And so it is really starting to standardize the basics, standardize things to a common data model that can be quality checked and characterized and grow. And so building out modules as things go along. And then as healthcare organizes in a more efficient process and a standardized process, then you'll be able to add modules as things go along. And so this has been the approach here for Cornette. And so one of the things that you would think would be pretty easy, like labs, are pretty hard. So how many different units for platelets or hemoglobin A1C? And that's just in the US. And then if you start thinking about global studies, then that's an even bigger challenge. But it has been focused on this continuous cycle of data curation. So going through and understanding what's there, doing characterization to improve that, to make sure that things are standardized. And the other thing that happens as well is that there can be people who change things in the health system that may not necessarily be known to the researchers. And so you can see as data gets characterized over time that there's been some fundamental change that all of a sudden, someone's procedures went to zero. Well, that's probably not the case. And so how you do that? One of the things that's a little unique here is that it is based on a distributed infrastructure, in that one way to solve the problem is to just get everyone to send their data. Let's just say that we're at the edge of chaos, and this is the place that's fundamentally going to change things, and it's trusted by all partners. And so you could just have all data come here. Well, my guess is that people are going to have some questions about that. And so that's why things have been built so that data stays inside the firewalls and that researchers can come into what we call the front door with a research question that can translate to SAS executable code, and that query goes into the data partners, and then the aggregated data comes back. So that's one key feature here that it can be used. That doesn't mean that's the only thing, because certainly with patient consent, you can get data come centrally. But the real purpose here is like, how do you start creating reusable tools to query the data? You know, how do you start building modular programs that can be reusable? So when you understand the exposure, when you understand the outcome, and you say like you have a common set of things that you want to do over and over, that's really the benefit of having a network that's reusable. And so starting to think about that, and so then, you know, could you actually start just giving the Mad Libs crypt sheet to people and do this? And so that's started. And then really it's a constant learning. So we're talking about learning healthcare system in terms of generating evidence, but actually we need a learning research system. And so that's also implicit here as well. So now just to give what are the results? Well, the good news is that it turns out there are millions of people that walk through the doors of Cornette. And if you look over the last year, how many people walk through Cornette doors, it's over 40 million. And if you go back several years, then you can add another 80 million encounters or so for that. And it represents, generally speaking, what we see in the US. So all ages, you know, diversity across different areas. And hopefully this can be something where people can start thinking about how could you actually leverage a national system at scale to do different things. And just to highlight, I mean, there are populations here that may be of great interest. So like there's a very strong pediatrics interest, and so 11 million or so kids there, if you call kids less than 20. And then also thinking about older populations as well, so pretty diverse. And this is just an example of different conditions that have that you can get counts on of what's there. And so using computable phenotypes or codes that have been used for, say, programs such as Sentinel, but also other programs that have validated computable phenotypes, so codes that are used that are part of a routine care that can have known at least sensitivity and specificity about, you know, that a given diagnosis. And so looking at common conditions as well as rare conditions such as ulcerative colitis. And then one of the big things is saying, well, there's going to be all this lab data. How can you actually translate this into actually information? And you know, for specific studies, you say, wow, this is amazing. But you also need to understand what some of this actually really means. And so specific studies, like this is where people will focus on in terms of understanding, you know, how consistent is the data around certain important lab areas as well. But certainly you see a lot of labs. Now, in terms of what's happening now, like just, you know, people are really interested in designing studies around Cornette. How can you actually leverage this? And really is trying to pull all the pieces together. And one of the first things that we're really trying to push forward is like actually engagement. Shouldn't you ask people how they would design a study or be part of a study or participate in a study, you know, whether it's a participant, a study coordinator, or a clinician or a health system? So for example, my mother, if she were approached for the aspirin study or adaptable, and they say, okay, we're gonna have you come in on every Thursday at 2 o'clock to get your medication, there's absolutely no way. But you say, okay, we're gonna only get your data through the internet or by phone call, and we're gonna give you your treatment. Well, then the answer is potentially yes. And then also combining that to what are the things that can be leveraged within Cornette versus other things. You'll hear more about like other incredible tools and approaches for doing other things in terms of extracting electronic health record data, collecting PROs directly from participants, putting that on the backbone of a common data model, using those for actually generating study data analysis that can be reusable, and then feeding back onto the systems to actually change the care. So what if you had a study that you actually were able to tell all participants and participants like them what the answer was instantaneously. The systems should be able to do that. The data is there. In some ways, you could actually argue it's almost unethical that you allow people to come across the health systems when there are known answers that are better. So the engagement part, I just want to emphasize because it's been a lot of fun working with different groups. And one of the things that we have realized is that every time we have put forward a protocol, there hasn't been anything that came out with no changes. So we've always learned something, and this is one of our partners, Bray Patrick Lake, and essentially noted various things like how do you get to real people that would be representative of what you encounter, making sure the studies are feasible. But then there's these other things. There's this thing between patients and their data, and they're called clinicians. And we started recognizing, well, how do you actually integrate things in the workflow? We're adding more and more burden to clinicians. Just fill this out, just check this. It'll take 5 minutes. And so 20 other people say it just takes 5 minutes. And so then you see what happens. So really thinking about how that can change as well. Here's some examples of that for the adaptable study on randomized trial on aspirin. We have what they self-named themselves called the adapters, and just wrote a perspective piece with one of those, Henry Cruz here. And then we recently pulled this group for a cluster randomized trial called Connect HF. And you notice this guy, he's actually from LA, but he came at the beginning of March Madness. And so he was really motivated about changing the world, including basketball. So he thought his t-shirt was going to be priceless at the end of March. And really start not just thinking about what can be within the Cornette as kind of a starting thing, but also are the things that can actually leverage with related items around PeopleCentered. So not just thinking within a box, but also thinking outside the so-called PeopleCentered box, as everything's tied to electronic health records, from doing key things in and out here. And so this is something where this is a punch list for us for PeopleCentered of how can we continue to grow these different areas. And then I want to kind of highlight some case examples. There are 14 PeopleCentered-funded PeopleCentered demonstration projects here across the spectrum: interventional studies, observational studies, people-powered research network studies, and health system studies. But really going to just highlight 2 of those. So the aspirin study, or adaptable. This is really asking a question that is, if you knew actually the answer of whether 81 versus 325 of aspirin mattered, you could potentially address 19,000 deaths or heart attacks a year, or thousands of bleeds annually in the US. Now that's a simple question. It seems like we should know the answer. And if you start adding decades to that question, how many lives have potentially passed? So it's organized in really what I call the ultra pragmatic trial. So there's a pragmatic randomized trial, and then there's randomized trial. And so this is kind of on the far end of the spectrum, but our goal is to electronically identify and enroll 20,000 participants using PeopleCentered. So applying computable phenotypes, so codes against data marts across the network, and then electronically approaching those people, having their baseline data come from PeopleCentered, and then through follow-up mechanisms, through either a portal that they interact with, or by phone if they're not internet savvy, collect patient-reported outcomes, medication use, but then also collect outcomes using the PeopleCentered common data model. As people come back into the health system and generate encounters, using that really to collect their outcome data, and then also tying it to other data sources to have complete data with other payer data. Now you can go and play around adaptablepatient.com to actually experience what it's like. This was co-designed with the adapters and how this would work, and has electronic consent that actually has a comprehension tied to it. And to date, we're pretty happy with progress here. The normal cardiovascular trial enrolls at about 1 participant per site per month or less. Usually the benchmark is 0.5. And so we can see these different networks that are different stages in development, that you have ranges of enrollment up to 48 participants per site per month. I have to give a shout out to Vanderbilt because Vanderbilt just totally rocks here. They have really led the way in terms of doing a multi-pronged approach and lead the efforts for Mid-South. It certainly got Duke's competitive juices going. And so we're actually trying to catch up to them, and it looks like we're constantly trying to catch up to them, but then Vanderbilt had an incredible week last week. So, and the one thing that we're using this also as an example, and I think this is how all studies should be, is that not only learn and address a question, but how do we learn how to make the next study better? And so for a question that's as simple as aspirin over the counter, you'd be amazed at what the consent originally looked like that people wanted. The template was like 14 pages. We actually got it to 4.5 pages and co-designed it with participants and met the regulatory requirements with it. And so it really went through a multi-stage process, and we think we had a much better consent process here. And this is something I think we need to take on nationally and use these networks here. And so, for something like that, we wind up having a lot of different consents. So if you imagine something like that, like we have 30 sites, how many different consents would we have? Well, the answer is 30. That's amazing. That's a quality problem here that I think we need to be addressing. So another example is just on the observational side. There are 2 questions there. What's the right procedure for obesity, and do antibiotics and childhood contribute to obesity? So 2 different questions, 2 different age groups here. One is looking at bariatric surgery procedures to see what has long-term benefits, and then one is like really childhood antibiotic exposure can actually lead to, potentially to childhood obesity. So similar to like animal husbandry, where how animals get plumper is actually having antibiotics in their meals. And so does that actually happening in the US with our kids? And so the good news is if you look at data nationally from other sources, that you can see Cornette data essentially mirrors some of the procedure types over time. And then when you look at key areas that have been unexplored, you can really tap into areas that you would never imagine that this was happening. So in bariatric surgery, there are 904 adolescents that have had actually bariatric procedures. I mean, who would have imagined that? So, and then for the antibiotics, it's about 380,000 kids that will have primary outcome data to look at. So these are just examples of what's possible. Now to finish up, what's next is that we are really aiming to think about different kinds of research, but ideally we're thinking about like things that can be pragmatic and especially highly pragmatic randomized trials, and there are a variety of data sources to do this, but it certainly can be used for a variety of observational studies as well as other types of trials. And then as things go forward, PCORI has wanted this to be self-sustaining. And so we recently created this People-Centered Research Foundation, which is hopefully going to be a channel for other institutions, organizations to join as well. And so this is where I'm going to put the pitch to you all at UAB to hopefully join this foundation as things go forward. Things are still evolving. This has a mission statement right now to get it incorporated. It doesn't fit on a t-shirt, and so that'll likely change. And there's an inaugural board. Rob Califf, former FDA commissioner, is chairing it, but you can see the inaugural board is a representative of different organizations. So NIH, health insurance plans, patient organizations, industry as well, and payers. And the groups are working hard to get things in place for the transitions here, and hopefully we'll be able to start contracting with networks and also funders here starting in the summer. And if you want more information, just go here. We're also looking for an executive director, so if you're interested, let us know. So just in summary, like I think these are things that kind of a checklist that was actually put forward a couple of years ago of what's really needed for a learning national health system or a research system. And the idea is like, how do we engage people and organizations? Are we always doing that effectively? A collaboration framework, so people are paying it forward, doing everyone else's research. Having analysis ready, standardized data, but also making sure we protect privacy. And then ability to embed research in care settings. And that we do need to remember these things called clinicians are there. And then also making sure that we do the right things, that there is regulatory oversight, but we actually do it in a way that is without unnecessary burdens to getting to administrative simplicity. So I'll stop there, and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. I want to ask a question around the standardized data, common data model. So when we talk about common data model, do you have a systematic way to standardize the rules? You talked about the lab values, for example, and you have this many institutions and data coming from there. What's the systematic way to standardize rules for those? And in relation to that, I'm sure you have a lot of data cleanup jobs. And how are you doing the standardization on that? And
standardization on what?
With your data cleanup processes. And are you storing that criteria so that the researchers, when they come in to pull the data, they know how the data was cleaned up?
Right. So, so one of the things is that and you can go to the website, and you can go through several hundred pages of specifications of the common data model. I usually pull it out to help get to sleep at night, but essentially, you can imagine with so many different health systems and also different EMR implementations, even if you have Epic at, say, Duke and UNC, you have different implementations of those. And so really, it's up to the health system in terms of understanding what they have and standardizing it to what's the specifications in a common data model. And so that is how that has worked. And there have been different approaches where, like, some health systems will just say, or networks, they actually have different purposes that they're trying to meet. So they actually will have standardized ways for something that is needed for their health system, but also doing it to meet that common data model, per Cornette common data model specifications. We wind up going through data characterization so we can look to see how well that is standardized. And so one thing you can do is you're able to not only kind of compare with what's expected, what's outliers, and also what's relative to within a network, but also across different networks. But then also when there's a specific study, we usually wind up doing additional characterization to say, okay, is this really what we expect, and is it indeed accurate? Depending on the type of study, then there also may need to be further validation approaches as well regarding what's the purpose or key questions. But if you imagine wanting a system that has some fundamental basis for doing that, and then doing deeper dives for specific studies, that's kind of the approach right now. So, and then in terms of the so-called data cleaning, the question is, would you go and data clean everything in healthcare? So we're trying to actually use what's most commonly and routinely available for this purpose. But say there's something that would be of interest, and I'll use heart failure as an example. New York Heart Association class is something people consider as important. There are 4 categories that, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's hardly ever documented. And so then you try to interpret what that could be like. And that's a problem that we'd have for those types of characteristics.
Just a practical question. In terms of this being a resource potentially for secondary data analysis, can it be viewed that way? And if you could give maybe some examples of how it has been used for that purpose.
Yeah, so one thing that we'll aim to do is as studies are completed, embrace the open science principles, so having shareable data sets. There's certain situations that's harder because of distributed network. So where data stays in the health system, and so that is a much harder principle. But for example, adaptable, like, we'll have that publicly available.
How important is universal consent? That's a topic that I know we've discussed here as an institution, and be interested to know what Duke is doing and what some of the other nodes are doing. The challenges is trying to get people, when they have the encounter in the healthcare system, to agree for future research so you can access their identifiable data and potentially biospecimens. What's been the general approach through Cornette to that?
So one, I'd say it's all over the place right now. Like there's different institutions have, I'll just say, cultural legacies about this. So, but I think this is something that we want to increasingly standardize. So right now, if you imagine most health institutions, before they can see someone, they actually make a patient sign a form that says, I will pay you no matter what, even if my insurance doesn't pay, and I will not sue you either. And so we would like them to also have a form that says, I'm interested in research, and here are 3 categories, donating my data, being contacted, and actually being using my samples. And so there are different examples where that's been implemented, and so we want to actually push that forward. There's also the outside-in approach, where there's technology now where essentially patients have direct rights for their data, and we're going to be experimenting with those platforms. An example is an application called Hugo or things like that, where you can actually tie into health systems and be able to, and as individuals, agree to donate your data in different areas. So.
So I have a question according to the clinicians involved in this research. I know like there's a clinical guideline for the doctor to make their decision, but since this is like a group research, you have 13 groups participate in this network. So I'm guessing there will be some variance within like each doctor's judgment during the research. How do you address that problem?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So. Yeah, so there are 2 things to think about. One is actually variation practice could actually be exploited to understand what's the best results. And so we've done a lot of work in terms of outside of Cornette, but exploiting that to understand, as different health systems or clusters of clinicians, if they actually have different practice patterns that are more uniform, and does that associate with different or better results. So that's one attribute that can be taken care of. Now, there are examples where in certain areas where clinicians have decided, well, we're going to standardize our assessment of XYZ condition. And so we actually, I actually think of rheumatology is a great example, where there's often incredibly complex diseases, but a group of clinicians that are really smart saying, like, for us to learn, we just need to agree that we're going to collect the same information and have different standard protocols for conditions, and that way we can learn to see, is it better or less better or worse than before. That's happened in ulcerative colitis, where a group of clinicians essentially were standardizing their approach, and they could show that their remission rates improved over time. So like everybody,
sorry. So like every clinician involved in this network, they were kind of like constantly meeting with each other.
Well, there are actually hundreds of thousands of clinicians here, so like that would be, it'd be harder than getting Congress to agree. But in certain areas, you can certainly do that. But and that would be, it would take clinical champions to do that. So in certain areas, that's definitely possible. But I'll just use cardiology as an example. Like, we can't even get 70 cardiologists at Duke to agree what chest pain is.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
No, we need this for the recording.
Thanks. I was wondering, in thinking about leveraging this network for health disparities research, it strikes me that the systems that may be the most likely to sign up the fastest would be those that have largely insured populations and patient portals where patients are a little more savvy around going in and looking up their own information. And so I was wondering if you have a sense for what proportion of patients within this network are either of low SES status or uninsured.
So I don't have that answer, but in terms of that, that's a great question. So, and we actually have a what we call a collaborative research group. There are 11 of these groups that are focused in different areas to catalyze use of the network. So cancer, cardiology, et cetera. And one is on health disparities. And so just understanding that basic fundamentals is key. We actually think that this offers an opportunity for addressing those issues for two reasons. One is most of the data that's around populations that are underserved aren't in, say, the Optums of the world by the very nature. The second thing is that the network actually covers every state and then covers in regions that particularly have challenges there. So Louisiana is an example for that. There's one of the networks called Advance that's actually made up of safety net clinics. And so that's a kind of a key orientation for them. And so they're actually doing some projects across the network. So we think it's actually ripe for that type of research. The other thing that we're trying to garner, we'll see if this is successful, is that Cornette and then PCRF is by intent or by design is going to be used by multiple stakeholders and also funded by multiple stakeholders. So it won't necessarily just be on NIH. And industry is a good example of that. And if you ask industry leaders, do they care about health disparities? They all raise their hand. And then you ask them, do they fund any health disparities research? They all put their hands down. And so we're going to try to change that.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Dr. Jim Semino, head of our Informatics Institute, will now introduce the next speaker.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Paul Harris, who is at Vanderbilt University. He's a professor of biomedical informatics and biomedical engineering there, and has about 20 years of experience in clinical research informatics. He earned his doctorate degree in biomedical engineering at Vanderbilt and now is there as the director of Vanderbilt's Office of Research Informatics. He designed and created Redcap, which I think is probably what he's best known for. This is a research data capture system, clinical trials data management system that is free for use. And it's now being used in, 25 academic institutions, academic and nonprofit institutions in 108 countries worldwide. He also created a national program for patient recruitment called Research Match, which is allowing individual institutions to recruit volunteers that can then serve in national research studies. And currently they have 115,000 volunteers and 4,800 researchers across 138 academic institutions. So a huge impact nationwide and worldwide in clinical research informatics. He has interests in novel strategies for data collection, analysis, and dissemination, participant recruitment, engagement and return of value, and software collaboration and dissemination. He currently serves as a PI for the NIH NCATS Recruitment Innovation Center, or RIC. He's the co-PI for the Corey Mid-South CDRN, informatics lead for Vanderbilt's Clinical and Translational Science Award Program, technical leader for the Vanderbilt Verily Broad Precision Medicine Initiative programs. I don't know how he found time to come down here to visit us, but we're very glad that he did.
Thanks so much, Jim. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to basically tell a number of stories today, and my task was to think about implementation and innovation. And you'll find soon that I don't stick to my own script even when I'm speaking. And so I've found that a lot of bullet points just don't work for me. So I end up telling stories. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I'm going to tell a number of stories around projects that we've developed, the lessons learned from those studies, from those projects to that I think really apply to any project or program that you might build. I should say up front as a disclaimer that after each of these stories, I'll kind of highlight some lessons learned. I could just as easily have pulled a number of projects that were complete failures because I violated these principles, but I chose the successful ones because that was more fun for me. If we have time, I want to talk about a few passion projects that we've got going on right now that I think may be of interest and I hope may be of interest because we're always looking for collaborators and new things. So my mom's slide is not nearly as fun as Adrian's slide, but my mom about every 6 months, I don't know if your moms are like this too, but my mom about every 6 months, I'll be talking with her and she'll say, "What is it that you do again?" Because she doesn't understand this word. What's that? Yeah, right. So you know, my mom, she doesn't want to understand the word informatics, and you know, she doesn't care about all of that. But you know, I think you know this usually comes after maybe she's talking to one of her friends, and she's saying, you know, I know you work at Vanderbilt over there, but what do you do again? So I explained to her again, here's the deal. You know, I get to wake up every morning, look across Vanderbilt's research enterprise and look for ways that, you know, in a disease neutral way, if we could build tools and methods that would help any type of research, then that's kind of fair game for what we do in the Office of Research Informatics. She rolls her eyes at me and then she asks me again in 6 months because it's not terribly exciting to her, but it really is an exciting space. In 2007, we looked across Vanderbilt's enterprise and said that, you know, we've been in the clinical informatics domain for a long time, and there's a lot to be gained there. But in terms of the last mile, how this is impacting our research enterprise, we really have some gaps. And so we started this office. These are more or less the things that we think about every day and so forth. This, I want to give credit to Duke, since Adrian's here, that I stole this part of the slide from Duke. And it's basically to remind me that, you know, research goes all the way from well before bench to well outside of bedside and then back and forth. So the first story is about Redcap. Redcap stands for Research Electronic Data Capture, and really it was born back in 2004. In 2004, there were a lot of things going on in the world. The one thing that really was bothering me at Vanderbilt was HIPAA, not HIPAA privacy, but HIPAA security. And I knew, because I'd been working with researchers for many years and building one-off databases, if you will, to store information about prospective studies. I knew when I was sitting down one day filling out a HIPAA security questionnaire around one of our systems at Vanderbilt. I think it was a core laboratory system, and I was answering these 36 questions on this blue sheet of paper. You know, it's so fresh in my mind even that I thought, you know, how ridiculous is it that I'm answering these 36 questions about this system at Vanderbilt when I know for a fact that people are emailing data sets around. They're collecting information on these multi-million-dollar studies sometimes in FileMaker Pro. Or you know, pick a platform, and I love all of those platforms, but they don't, you know, this HIPAA security stuff is not going to be satisfied with the way we're doing business now. My hypothesis at the time was that researchers weren't out there using FileMaker Pro or SurveyMonkey or what have you, because they just wanted to sort of snub their nose at best practices of data security. They were doing it because they were really smart. They had important projects that needed to be done, and we weren't giving them the tools to basically take this back to a centralized approach where, you know, HIPAA security and you know, other important features were sort of baked in. So we kind of came up with this idea that if we could figure out a way to deliver those tools, if we can make it easier to do the right thing than the wrong thing, then the researchers would sort of come on board. Problem was we had many projects and we had few programmers, and we didn't want to really have, you know, 1,000 programmers working on 1,000 or 2,000 research projects. So we came up with this idea that if we can figure out a way to get the data about the data or metadata for a project into a table, a structured database table, and then maybe we could build one app, and that app could morph for every study depending on the data about the data. So we set about doing that. That allowed us to sort of hit some really easy but useful core features early on that I'll tell you about in a second. And then we launched that first Redcap project in 2004. The way that we launched that project and about the next 50 projects at Vanderbilt looked something like this. There'd be somebody that had maybe heard about it or somebody that hadn't heard about it, and they're looking for support for a research project. And they said, hey, Paul, how can you help us build some sort of data management platform for this particular project? And I would say, no, but let's meet about that. And let me talk about this new thing that we've got going on. It's web-based. It's really easy to configure. It's really free, it's free for you to use. You don't know it and you don't care about it, but it's HIPAA compliant, and that's going to help with your IRB and your grants and so forth. And it's super fast. You can have one of these tomorrow. So would you like one of these? I swear I must have given this talk 100 times, and I would spend the first 45 minutes basically saying that and showing them some modules. And then I would say, do you want this for your study? And remember, it's free. And every one of them would say, yeah, we can't wait to have that. Part of that was, showing them that, the first piece of this is getting good quality data in. So your research coordinators are going to love the fact that it is web-based. You can share it with your colleagues and partners, et cetera. And it's human readable. It sort of looks more like something that you'd want to interact with on the computer rather than something that is a spreadsheet, if you will. So it does all of that stuff right. The next question was literally, Paul, what if you get hit by a bus? So if you get hit by a bus and we've kind of converted out of our FileMaker Pro, what are we going to do then? Well, we better make an export module for you. And while we're building an export module, why don't we make that friendly so that you can get it out, because we know the metadata and we know the data, and we know from here that we're collecting everything in the right way, that we're getting all that validation right. We can not only get the export right, but we can spit out the data about the data in a way that SAS understands your data set or Stata or what have you. And we've been doing a lot on other projects. We've been doing a lot of work on de-identifying EHR records at the time. So we put some of that feature set into the export module. So really just with those couple of modules and all of the audit trail stuff, that was kind of the base package of Redcap in the early days. So the answer was always, yeah, we want this. We can't wait to get this for our study, and this is what we'll do. We'll send over our, we'll get our coordinator to send over the data requirements. And that's the point where I would say, nope, that's not the way we're going to do this, because you guys know your study a lot more than, you know a lot more about autism or Parkinson's or whatever you're studying than I do. And you don't want me stopping to try to, or hiring people to sort of translate that into this model. Better yet, if we could teach your team how to do that. If it's really, really easy, then it's iterative. You control your own destiny. You have the power to do this, and I can go on and create that next module that you're asking about. So that was really the big sales pitch, right? That was the part that took that last 15 minutes, and I would send them home with a recipe and say, if you'll do this, I promise, within 24 hours, you'll have one of these up and running, and you'll get excited about it, and you'll want to continue on. So that's really how the early days of it went. One of the things that we found was that once this started, especially since we were sort of handpicking some of those folks early on that were from big research labs, we found that if you get somebody that's in a big research lab and they start using your tool, then everybody else is going to be starting to use the tool pretty soon too. So by the end of that year, I think it was August of 2004, we started with Project 1. By December, we were at about 20 projects that were running in this new Redcap platform, which sounds pretty modest now. But if you were used to building these one at a time, well, that was a pretty significant number of folks using it. Just at the end of that year, we did this survey. This was kind of a funny thing, but I just wanted to know, is it working well? How hard is that metadata creation process? What should we change? It was mostly a QI project, but I stuck this one question in about, did it improve your science? And it was funny because we got a bunch of good input, really really critical input. People weren't just saying, you know, we love it, thanks for doing it. You know, it was really good input, but every single person said it improved the science. Now, in reality, it's not the widgets, you know, it's not the on-screen stuff that improved the science. It was the empowerment, right? You know, it was that ability to change your mind tomorrow, to basically get everything right, share it with your statistician or your coordinator or whoever was collecting the data, and they have time before the study starts to basically change things, because we're not having to go through a programmer each time. But it was really cool, and you know, I kind of take pride in that, you know, even though my mom might not know it, you know, that by empowering these really smart folks with infrastructure, we're hopefully improving health. Something else that happened just about every time in one of these in these exercises, these sales pitches early on, was that somebody would say, "This is great, Paul, but will it do X?" And sometimes the answer was, "Yeah, it'll do X. Just give me about 5 more minutes and I'll come around to that." But usually it was, "No, it won't do X. But I heard about that last week too." So that sort of this principle of used systems get better, you know, absolutely rings true, as long as you listen to the end user. Usually that's the sort of thing that would make it into the next module, you know. So no, but wait till next month and I bet it will. The tricky thing about that, though, as a systems builder, is keeping everything, you know, building in complexity, and but making it simple. Because basically Redcap now has many modules. If you need to randomize your patients, you know, it'll do that. If you need to do patient-reported outcomes and do surveys at crazy intervals, it'll do that too. But if you don't need all of that, then if we make it too complex to set up, then people are going to go back to FileMaker Pro, right? So the trick is the trick, I think, that we, you know, often sort of challenge ourselves with, is continuing to add on those good ideas, those new modules. Now, keep it designed for the researcher so that they understand it. You know, do all of the informatics stuff right, of course, but make sure that first and foremost we're keeping our researchers in mind. And then, you know, again, kind of going back to that. Maybe a bad time of year to be talking about this platform, but thinking about it like TurboTax. You know, TurboTax, you know, if you don't need Schedule C, then you know, it asks a few questions and you don't get Schedule C. So Redcap, we try to sort of build to that same framework where we ask a few questions and then just kind of tack on the complexity as needed. One of the questions that came up about the third one of these exercises was, "It's great, can I use it for my basic science studies?" And that was kind of an aha moment for me that, you know, why not? You know, the Redcap, you know, this is a database, this is software. It really doesn't know or care whether a line of data is about a person or a mouse or a test tube. So from that, you know, we really kind of tried to keep the platform generalizable. And I've been criticized a lot, you know, by folks who say, "Why don't you just make it, you know, the absolute perfect, you know, phase 3 clinical trial system, or you know, why don't you sort of pick this up and just get down to building the most perfect CTMS system we can imagine?" And the reason is that, you know, I like all of those use cases and I like all of those platforms, but if we really just focused in on one of those areas, we'd kind of leave behind a lot of folks that we want to support, and also we'd sort of lose the richness of the diversity of use cases coming in. So, but you know, the answer was sure. You know, you can use it for anything that you want, and we found now that you give smart people access to general, you know, solid tools, and they do things all the time that just sort of amaze us in terms of what they're using the platform for, including basic research. We're probably seeing our biggest growth now in global health, but you know, I think it's because it's a lightweight technology stack and relatively easy to use. So it's kind of a fun exercise. Back in 2004, I think I did a well, I'll talk a little bit about the consortium next and the fact that it's not just Vanderbilt users using it anymore. But as part of that, we have some sort of tracking mechanism to be able to tell when people are citing Redcap. So we pull those publications, and it sort of helps us know who's using Redcap and for what across the world. But back maybe a few years ago, maybe in 2014, I was just kind of looking at this, and over a 5-month period, I was going to give a talk somewhere, but over a 5-month period, I was just kind of scanning through some of the articles, and I found that the top one there is a paper that was published about a canine model, you know, disease model, Second one there was a dog bite prevention intervention in the emergency rooms. And the third one was evaluation of dogs with trauma. So it was a veterinarian paper. And I thought, well, how cool is that? That now I get to show this screen. But it just goes to show you again that, you put really smart, you put good tools in smart people's hands and they'll do really cool stuff. So this is what Redcap looks at at Vanderbilt as of yesterday. So we're up to about 44,000 projects. You can sort of see, sorry about the go-to over here, but you can kind of see that there's a lot of projects that are research, and they kind of cross that spectrum. There's also a lot of operational quality improvement and so forth. This is kind of what a week at Vanderbilt looks like right now. We've probably got about 600 concurrent users in using Redcap. And we do a whole lot of multi-site type studies and coordination. So these are where people are logging into our local system. So the guiding principles and lessons learned here, I think, from Redcap would be, focus on this universal problem. Designing for the user, in this case, the researchers. I can't tell you how many times people have sort of joined the consortium, which we'll talk about next, and told us, here's how we're going to go ahead and just fix that platform of yours from the informatics side. And I always appreciate that. But usually my recommendation would be, why don't you come on in and get used to it, and let's talk about the researcher use cases and so forth, and then we'll kind of talk about the informatics underneath. So designing it first and foremost for the user that you want to help, and that's the researcher. That finding and empowering early adopters, being able to sort of hit those big labs rather than a bunch of small ones incrementally helped. Listen to the end users a lot, and then use that input to evolve. Again, I wish I had coined this phrase, used systems get better. That was one of my mentors, Dan Masis at Vanderbilt, and I use it all the time, but I think it's absolutely true. Manage expectations. So even though I might say, hey, wait till next month and that feature will be maybe in Redcap, I always made a point, and still do, to never promise a function that's not in there today. Because every now and then we get into something and we have to kind of roll back. Well, that's more complicated than we thought. I always want people to be happy with the Redcap platform, and I never want them to be mad at me because it won't do this. So the promise is free. Use it for whatever you want. I'm not guaranteeing that it's going to evolve this way, but I'll tell you it might. Leverage that earned trust. It's amazing once we have a good trust relationship with those researchers at Vanderbilt. The next crazy idea that we have around, hey, I think we could do this. It's easy to get those folks on board to help us. Promoting, even at Vanderbilt, we have folks on the on one side of campus that think Redcap is really nothing more than a survey engine. We have another group on another part of campus that think it's nothing more than traditional case report forms. So being able to sort of promote and re-promote on campus has been useful to sort of let people know that it can do more. And then finally, this measure as you go. I have to meet with my boss once a month. And it's always fun to bring to my boss that, here's some metrics and here's why, we should keep investing in this one and keep evolving it. So the next story I'll tell you is about the Redcap consortium. The consortium really started in 2006. I was given this talk at a national meeting and basically describing, here's how Vanderbilt's sort of dealing with this whole HIPAA thing, how we think we're going to scale it out and how we think we're going to be okay. And sort of a tagline of that, I must have said something like, if you're interested in collaborating, let me know. This guy from Puerto Rico happened to be at that meeting, and he said, we'd like to collaborate. And my boss sent me up here to this meeting to see what others are doing. So I said, well, you tell your boss that it's going to take me a while to de-Vanderbilt this thing, and I'd be happy. I want to collaborate with you, but you tell your boss that I want 5% of your effort for 3 months. And then we'll make a go of this and kind of experiment with it. And he came back about 2 weeks later and he said, my boss says he'll give you 30% of my effort for 6 months. So I said, okay, you're a lousy bargainer, but yes, I'll take that. But that was really how it started. And his boss happened to be a biostatistician. So all of that export stuff that you saw, that was his job. That first year was, you help me figure out how we're gonna sort of frame these data exports, right? The next year, the same guy and I were presenting at the same meeting, and we had another couple of guys from the Medical College of Wisconsin. Same deal. We want in, so we said, okay, you can get in, but you to deal with we want you to put your effort into thinking about abstracting logins, because logins look different at Vanderbilt than at Medical College of Wisconsin and UAB. They did a great job with that. So then, the next year we said, well, let's just proactively engage, invite 10 of our best friends out there. And this took a little bit of arm twisting, because now we were going out and proactively grabbing folks, and they trusted us, and that worked out really well. At some point during that 10, we decided that this extracting effort from people didn't really scale. So we said, because you can't manage a bunch of volunteer programmers that well. That long. So we relaxed you don't have to put effort into this, but there's something that you're going to find along the way, whether it's leading a committee, something where you can contribute. So it's kind of like you're in, but you owe us something later on. It's kind of a Godfather thing, right? So that worked out pretty well, and I'm not going to tell you about the rest of them, but that was really how it was born, and really I think that same volunteer spirit that started, we'll give you the software, we'll give you the support in exchange for, you helping us improve it. It really sort of lives today in the consortium. So the consortium as of yesterday was up to 2,346 institutions in 109 countries. We are really missing Antarctica here in terms of, getting coverage on the map. So if anybody has collaborators in Antarctica, we'd love to see them. But it's really been a lot of fun, and the model is still, we'll give it away. No cost. You set it up. You own your own data. You support your own researchers, and we've got this consortium that will help with train the trainer and set up advice and all sorts of things. And we've got all kinds of committees that do all kinds of things, and it's really great. One of those great partners is UAB. So over on the right-hand column there, you see sort of the number of users. You have a number of different installations of Redcap, and I think all total I counted about 1,500 partners, 1,500 users at UAB, and for that I say thanks. So one of the questions that I got for a while from my boss was, when is enough enough? It's fun that you're playing around with this collaboration thing and this consortium thing, but why do you care about the 2,320th partner? And the reason is, what we found is, again, it goes back to that volunteer community. So we obviously don't even expect, all of those Redcap partners to seat people on committees and that sort of thing. But what we found is that, and what we kind of promise is, the people that contribute the most, they have the loudest voice in what comes next. And that model kind of works. And contributing most really might mean that you answer a whole lot of posts on our message boards, or it might be that you lead a committee, or whatever. But we've really developed some heroes there that are really responsible for a lot of this, success of the platform. This is my favorite picture. It's brand new as of yesterday. This is Bastavir at the University of Washington, and his new child there, who I think is two weeks old, and he looks a little bit miffed that he doesn't have the admin password to that Redcap tablet. So the other reason why that next partner is important to us is the use cases. So I mentioned we're doing a lot in global health right now. It would take us a century to collect as many use cases as we've collected by sharing out globally with folks, and that new users bringing use cases that bring innovation, it really rings true. My favorite story here, one of my favorite stories here, was I got on an elevator a while back with somebody in my building. The person worked for a pharma company. It's Amy Rock here. You can tell my photoshopping skills are a little subpar. But Amy started talking to me, and she said, hey, she's with a pharma company in town, and she said, hey, we're using that Redcap for a trial. And it's in Denmark, and we got a collaborator out from Poison Control Center in Denver, and he helped us kind of figure out how to set things up, and the way we set it up, it shaved 6 months off that trial. I thought, that is so cool, because I never knew this was happening, and we've got a partner in Denmark working with a partner in Denver, to help this pharma company get something out there faster. So I think, again, it's just sort of that. For me, at least, it was sort of a feel-good story about why the consortium itself is valuable. Global health, here's a neat project that I think wouldn't have happened without Redcap in Kenya. where they've used offline tablets to collect data on about 27,000 folks. This one just came to me yesterday. We have a group that's doing a lot of really cool stuff in Guatemala, and you kind of see the things that they're doing over there on the side there. So there's a lot of really smart people using it for a lot of neat things because of the consortium. But the point of all of that is that the true power is not the platform, and it really never has been. It's been the end users and now, you know, I think the consortium itself. So I've got less guiding principles and lessons learned here, but I think the first one would be choose those initial partners carefully. I think really actually a number 0 would be don't collaborate just to be collaborating. You know, I've tried that and it doesn't work. You know, find something that really is a win-win on both sides and needs to be done. But after that, you know, I think choosing the initial partners carefully, remembering, and every technologist that I know will tell you the same thing, that the informatics or the technology is always the easy part. You know, the relationships, the governance, all of those sorts of things, those are more important to get right early on, and they're going to be very helpful downstream, and without them you just can't do it. Earn and maintain trust, listen and be diplomatic. This one's been kind of interesting. I like people to be happy, and I like people to like me, and I like people to like my platform. With a lot of users, particularly a lot of consortium users, you get a lot of great ideas. But also you really get some horrible ideas. So being able to be diplomatic enough to say, yeah, that's an interesting idea. While you know, that's probably never going to see the light of day. You know, that took me some skills, but you know, we've got a good consortium, and people really, you know, get it, I think. It slows you down at first. I mean, I can't tell you how many days in those early days of collaboration I went home thinking, good grief, all I did today was solve Puerto Rico's problem, and I needed to be developing this new thing over here. So it really will slow you down at first, these types of projects, and you know, I think you have to anticipate issues and problems. And one of the things I really had to sort of drill into my own psyche, but also into my team, is things are going to go bad every now and then. And when they go bad, you know, I think it's important that the whole team knows that our culture is we own it. And you know, I've had conversations with PIs at other institutions that were having a question about Redcap, where I felt like it's more fair for me to have that conversation than to ask the collaborator out there. Third story, I'll make this one a little bit quicker, but this one goes to research match. So back in 2001, this reminded me last night as I was reviewing these slides how old I am. But back in 2001, you know, we saw at Vanderbilt, I saw this really strange phenomenon. I'd pick up my phone every now and then, and somebody would say, hey, I got somebody on, it was an operator, hey, I got somebody on the line whose mom saw something on, heard something on NPR, and they want, and so I'm sending them to you. And I would say, well, why are you sending them to me? But it was because, you know, somehow that linkage had been made, and I had research in my title. So I would get these things, and I would have to patiently listen and say, look, I'm really sorry, I don't know about that study, but I can probably help you find it. So I knew there were a lot of people out there in Vanderbilt, you know, in the Nashville community wanting to participate in trials. And one of the other things I knew was that, you know, every researcher I know was looking for patients. So we had this idea, this is kind of a busy schematic, but we had this kind of idea that if we could build sort of an online registry, then people could volunteer and we could match them to Vanderbilt researchers, and you know, we'd be able to solve that problem. And it worked pretty well. This was early in the days of these, and the IRB had all kinds of questions, and I spent a lot of time learning about the IRB at that point. So we couldn't do everything that we wanted, but it worked pretty well. But one of the things that we found was that, you know, people from California are joining this thing. So why in the world would people in California be joining a Nashville registry? It sort of kind of dawned on us that, you know, this is not a Nashville problem. This is a universal problem that we all have. And so we thought about, well, what about a national model? And that's when we kind of had the idea, and through the CTSA implemented this platform called Research Match. So Research Match is it's a disease neutral, institution neutral tool. It is more or less the model that I just described. People can say, I want to be involved in research, and we have sort of this privacy preserving, you know, enable IRB and privacy guided approach to being able to allow researchers at any participating institution to be able to reach out and connect with these folks. It's free. It's complementary recruitment service. UAB has other recruitment services that can drill down farther into your EHR records and so forth. So do we at Vanderbilt. But this is sort of a public group of folks. It's safe, secure, and I mentioned the institution neutral. So screens kind of look like this. If I'm a potential volunteer, I take about 5 minutes and I fill out some information about myself. Demography, as you see here, medical conditions, and this one's the, really from an informatician standpoint, this is the coolest part because we're able to use some standard terminologies and concept mapping so that the patient can say, I've got a history of heart attack, and the physician can say, hey, I'm looking for people with MI. So we're doing all of that stuff right, we think. You can do the same thing with medications. And then there's another screen I forgot to include that says, how far are you willing to travel? So with that, we're able to sort of compute, how far are you away from Vanderbilt or UAB or any of the other partners and use that. So as a researcher logs in, there's a whole process in the trust model with institutions that are partners, and I'll skip all of that. But I will say that, the researcher, once they're in and they've got an IRB approved study, there's a pretty simple tool that allows you to kind of filter down and find from that 100,000 plus set of folks. These are the people that I think would be most useful to participate in this study or trial. Once you find that, there's a way to review the records in a de-identified fashion, stick in an IRB approved language, and then the volunteer gets a message that basically says Vanderbilt or UAB researchers are doing this type of research. And if you're interested, click here. We do have a mechanism that if you're using Redcap at your institution and you wanted to put a pre-screening survey, they can also, when they say yes, it can also direct them to your servers at UAB to fill out that pre-screening survey. After that, it's more or less the connection is made, and now the education and the onboarding works just about like any other trial or study. This one works as well. We've sorry, I thought I had a screen here that showed a map of where people were, but we've got volunteers from all over the country. As Adrian mentioned earlier, I'm a little bit embarrassed that Ohio State is a better research match partner than Vanderbilt, where we invent the thing. But we've got a lot of good institutions that are using it for good reasons. So lessons learned on that one would be make partners out of those regulatory groups early and often. The other two I've already mentioned, so I won't mention again, and then be opportunistic. Use every asset that you've got. And I mentioned some of the terminologies and the standards that we're able to deploy here, but also recognizing at some point that the way you get volunteers is you go to the advocacy groups and you figure out ways that you can help them, help their constituents. So it's 9:52. I can't remember. I've got to stop at 10. Is that right? Okay, so in the next 8 minutes, I just want to go over just a few of the things that we've got going on right now, the coming soon. These are things that I always ask when I go to another institution, whoever I'm talking to, I usually say, what are you passionate about right now? So these would be my 3 passion projects. One is tying Redcap to Epic, and we're not yet an Epic shop. We've been sort of a homegrown, build your own EHR system at Vanderbilt for a while, and that's really been great for a lot of things. As an informatician, it's a great playground. But come November, we're going to be an Epic shop. So as part of that, we've been working a lot with the Epic folks and trying to figure out ways that we can put hooks into the workflow of the hyperspace, the clinician view of the EHR, in my chart, the patient portal, and also sort of thinking about maybe cutting out the middleman in this methodology that we developed a few years ago that allows us to sort of hook Redcap up to research data warehouses for data flow, for the mapping of records in Redcap, mapping of records in the EHR system, and data flow for registries and longitudinal studies. I can say that we've had probably 2 to 3 months of just banging our head against the wall, trying to figure out, how we're going to do some of these connections and interoperable pieces. Just 2 weeks ago, we had what I think is our breakthrough, and we've been able to do some really cool proof of concept work We're not live, so I can't put this into production, but we have done some really cool proof of concept work that make me believe that we can probably pull these off a lot faster than we thought we would, and it's really enabling some new thinking about this intersection between the EHR system and the research systems. One of the really nice things, without boring you with a lot of standards discussion, is that I think the way we're doing this should be able to be implemented in a relatively easy fashion at other Epic installations. And I hope, because we're using sort of standardized transmission protocols, that we will be able to, that this will also be work that would inform maybe doing the same sorts of things in Cerner. So that's one of my passion areas, and it's one of the things that we've wanted to do for a long time, but not being in the Epic club, or not being in the store-bought EHR club, we really had some limitations on what we could do there. So another one that we're working on now, as Jim mentioned, I've been being part of this Recruitment Innovation Center for the Trial Innovation Network with the CTSAs. I'm spending a lot of my waking hours thinking about recruitment these days. And as we think about, what do we have in Research Match? It works pretty well, but if I really think about this guy, the volunteer, he's coming to a site like this for a reason. He wants to find trials. He wants to participate in research. And if you note the statistics of yesterday, at least, I've got 536 studies that are currently using Research Match. There's a lot more studies than that in the world, or in the country even today, that are recruiting. We have sort of a new platform, or a new sub-platform that we're launching out called Trials Today. And basically from this, we can pull from clinicaltrials.gov massage data and present it back to the volunteers in an interesting way. But we've got 19,000 recruiting projects across the US. And so, one thought of this would be, yeah, but we're the CTSA, or yeah, we're Research Match, and we're these institutions. And so the part of me has had to sort of deal with this, but going back to that principle of who are you designing this for? This guy doesn't care about the CTSA. This guy doesn't care about Research Match. This guy really just wants to participate in studies and trials. And so it's trying to figure out, a way that we can help more. If you care enough to be at a site like Research Match, that's what we're all about here. So we've done some preliminary work. We've got about a year's worth of data, being able to sort of present the right trial to the right person based on what they're telling us about themselves. And as part of that, we think we really got a model now that sort of leverages that whole Research Match ecosystem, and we can sort of do both. We can sort of treat these studies preferentially, if you will, while still presenting all other studies and trials, and maybe even helping with that initial contact. But that prioritization of projects, you can imagine that if we're going to present to you any project, first we might bubble up to the top of the list the ones that are Research Match studies. They're already registered in Research Match. Next, if UAB is a partner and University of somewhere else isn't, it might be polite to say, well, we'll prioritize the ones, all things being equal, we'll put the UAB ones at the top of the list, and so forth. So we're thinking some of that through. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that while we're thinking about that, the data that we need to decide whether a study is a Vanderbilt study or a UAB study, it's quite useful for us. It's necessary in that prioritization, but as a spin-off of that, we decided, hey, we're not going to build yet one more Vanderbilt-specific trials registry. We're actually just going to sort of rebrand, reskin, apply some of these rules, and we, again, we'll just save ourselves time, and we'll be able to sort of customize and use our own work for our own, our Vanderbilt local piece. What we found is that a lot of institutions are thinking the same way, and so we've got some really early collaborative partnerships with some of the institutions that you see here and others. And thanks to Jason Nichols, we've been thinking about this in a UAB view as well. I should say before you get excited that this is not live. It is password protected, and so even if your lawyers are here, I promise we're not doing anything that we shouldn't here. But it's really kind of an interesting way to get the recruitment folks banded together and sort of thinking about, how could we work together to maybe work globally as well as locally at our institution. So I'm hoping that will continue. And then the final thing I'll mention is we've been working for some time looking at patient-reported outcomes. So being able to sort of collect data directly from the patient. And Redcap for a long time has had a lot of survey capacity, but it's sort of one-off. You know, you'll get a notification by text or email, and it's time to take this survey. That's a lot different than sort of an application that you know, my mom would be happy to walk around with every day. So we've been developing, and we're just deployed I think 2 weeks ago in the App Store, this platform called MyCap. And it's really the exact same principle that we talked about for Redcap. Applications are expensive. They're expensive to develop one-off. So we've developed this method where we develop one app, we change in and out the metadata to make it study specific. The authoring platform here is basically our Redcap plugin, and the data come to live in Redcap, but it really is a native app, and it looks like, you know, you would expect a native app to look like. In addition to surveys and that sort of thing, which it does really well, it'll also do the active tasks. So, you know, if you wanted the research kit task ingested for a 6-minute walk, or you know, finger tapping, or some sort of cognitive task, it'll do those well. So we're about to launch these out. This is not live for everyone, but we're gonna pull it out in the next couple of weeks. We're gonna start building it out for some N-of-1 studies and a couple of pragmatic studies at Vanderbilt, and then we hope to have this launched out by August to the consortium. But if we have people that are interested in this, just let me know. That is all, and I think I'm right out of time. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, that was terrific. Questions for Dr. Harris?
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. I don't know if we have time, but I have 3 questions. When you started talking about describing informatics to your mother, you talked about disease-neutral ways of building platforms or methods. So when you're initiating these kind of projects, how do you find funding, especially when it's disease neutral? The second one is, you said that you're going from homegrown EHR to Epic. What are some of the decision-making criteria for that? I'm asking this generically, not necessarily for an EHR, but for any project when you're deciding to build in-home versus purchase from a vendor. And a third one, that you're talking about interoperability between Epic and Redcap, and you said that you had a breakthrough. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Does it have anything to do with the Smart on Fire platform?
So I'll answer them in different order, and I think there's a break afterwards, so we can talk a little bit about this during the break as well. The third one is yes, it is, you know, leveraging the Smart on Fire methods. The first one about funding and so forth, you remember the title is Build Small. Think big, build small, and evolve. So the trick, I think, is usually for funding as well as, is this really a good idea? To build it as small as you can. One of the things that people are used to hearing from me, you know, on a regular basis is, if we could do, this is a great grandiose idea that you have, Dr. Jones. If we could do something next Tuesday that would change your life, what would it be? And why don't we just start right there? And if it does bear fruit, then you know, we'll build on some more. If it doesn't, then we haven't lost much. Usually it doesn't cost much to build that first piece, particularly if we're just going to be leveraging something we already have, like Redcap. But if it hits and it does change the world, then usually the funding can be found. The second one I'm going to defer to the break, and that is, you know, what kind of considerations go into building and buying, and either small systems or big systems. But let's talk about that during the break.
It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Knight, who leads our HSR&D program at the VA, to introduce our next speaker. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you everyone, and welcome to the seminar. I'd like to, it's a great honor to introduce Dr. Amy Kilborn. Amy has at least 5 jobs right now, but I'm going to tell you about some of the important ones. Actually, they're all very important and demanding jobs. Amy is the director of the Quality Enhancement Research Initiative, or many of you may know it as the Query program in the VA, which is a national program focusing on implementation science. She's also professor of psychiatry at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in the medical school, and she's associate director for implementation and policy in the University of Michigan Depression Center. She's also director of the Michigan Mental Health Integration Partnership. And in addition to that, she is currently acting director of health services research in the VA nationally as well. I want to mention a few things about Amy that are significant and really describe her wide-ranging knowledge and skill sets. Amy had received her bachelor's degree at the University of California at Berkeley with a double major in microbiology and rhetoric. She has a master's in epidemiology from the University of California at Los Angeles, and also a PhD in health policy from UCLA as well. She's been the recipient of several very prestigious awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, or the PCASE Award. I also want to, just on a personal note, I worked with Amy in Washington, D.C. when I was in central office of the VA. We had offices next to each other, and it was really a wonderful opportunity to have Amy as a research leadership partner. I value her friendship and collaboration, and I welcome Amy to our seminar. Great.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. Great. Great, and it's really great to be here. This is my first time in the state of Alabama, and I need to get down here more often. I've heard a lot of great places I need to visit down here, so I guess I'll be coming back. So I'm going to talk about where we are with implementation science. And before I do that, how many of you are clinicians? Just raise your hands. Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to actually just set the stage with a couple of definitions. And I do this because I worked in both the worlds of quality improvement and implementation science. So I think of implementation, or I think of quality improvement as involving the analysis of healthcare performance and systematic efforts to improve it. So essentially just sort of general idea of improving the care that we deliver. Implementation science involves the study of the use of theory-based strategies to help frontline providers adopt and integrate effective clinical practices or evidence-based practices into routine clinical care. But they both have a common goal, although there are sort of our separate lines of thinking, and that is to really be able to get more frontline providers implementing evidence-based practices off the academic shelf into the hands of patients. And this is really where I think the challenge is, but also some of the greatest opportunities and actually some of the most fun types of research to do. Because what happens to many effective practices? So if you remember from Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones, he's the hero, he gets the ark, it's great, it's wonderful, but at the end of the scene, this is the final scene where it just sort of gets shelved off somewhere. So think of this as your research. You spend so much blood, sweat, and tears getting your research out there, your discoveries, and then only to have it on the academic shelf. And whether or not it was implemented nationwide or even locally, it's hard, sometimes hard to do. And that's because we got to think about this from the frontline provider perspectives. That's why I wanted to ask, how many of you are clinicians and whether or not this relates to you. So this words of wisdom from Winnie the Pooh. Here is Edward Bear coming downstairs now, bump, 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 on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way coming downstairs. But sometimes he feels that there really is another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment and think about it. So this is how we feel as day-to-day clinicians, just wanting to do the right thing, improve quality, and yet having to have something added, one more thing to our plates, another thing to implement, another best practice to utilize. And where implementation science and quality improvement come in is that there is that better way. We just have to sort of take a step back and think about it more if we have the time. And why is this important? This is the state of US healthcare now. I mean, debates about insurance and healthcare have been going on for years, but it's really about taking care of people with chronic conditions and mental health issues. There's a high burden of chronic conditions and a high cost associated with them. There's a high degree of fragmentation. I feel passionately about implementation science as someone in a department of psychiatry, because mental health in many respects is sort of that final frontier. You are trying to basically integrate and combine services from people who essentially got training in completely different areas. And it's not only physicians, you have social workers, you have psychologists, you have nurses, you have essentially peer support specialists. You have all sorts of different types, and you have people in the social services sector trying to help these folks and trying to work together to do that. At the same time, we only have half of US residents receiving effective care, and for mental health conditions, only a third receive minimally adequate treatment. This is also becoming a crisis in a population level. I don't know if anyone remembers seeing the article about a year and a half ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. This was an article showing that the rising mortality rates among lower class individuals or lower to middle class individuals was actually rising, particularly for working class whites. And what was, I think, striking about it was reversing a nationwide trend where mortality was actually going down, but then it started going up again. And this was a paper that was published by Ann Case and Angus Deaton in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that also attributed to this rising mortality of preventable causes. And if you think about it, it's essentially the poisonings from the opioid addictions and also the liver disease and also suicides. And it's not surprising that the VA's top priority now in the Department of Veterans Affairs is this sort of trifecta between substance use, suicide, and opioid abuse, and trying to deal with them all three at once. So this is a crisis nationwide, and especially in our VA, that we need to deal with it. And so I think, and also, if you think about it, even outside the VA healthcare system nationally, and you think about the issues in Medicaid, these are the top conditions that are causes for readmissions, and 4 of the 10 conditions are mental health related, which is why, again, I'm going to have a particular focus on mental health conditions in my talk about implementation science and the types of strategies to use. So getting back to sort of the reason for implementation science, and we saw this roadmap earlier, I think, on a couple of the slides, but stood to always recap. You have the T1 and T2 types of knowledge, essentially the translational knowledge. And again, where we are with implementation science is basically taking that knowledge into routine practice. It's really how to do it. It's the how-to. And implementation science doesn't have to really just be about theories that we have to run away from. I get kind of, my eyes glaze over when I see another theory or a framework. It's about taking that framework, making it come alive, having to figure out what you can do to give the providers the tools to use effective practices to reduce those mortality rates that are really happening. So we also do know, and why we need implementation science, is that best practices are not routinely implemented. We have 80% of medical research dollars don't result in public health impact. We have a lot of reasons for that, and there's definitely reasons at the organizational and provider levels. And you have, for every $1, you get a value of 20 cents, and then you have this essentially this bottleneck where a lot of these practices don't get implemented, and you essentially have less than 10 cents on the dollar actually getting implemented. And I have to thank my colleague Mark Bauer at the VA Center of Innovation in Boston for this slide. So this is how we often think about our research careers. So the point of doing the research is to do more research. So yeah, we have to do something about this research, don't we? So what do we do? So why do we care about implementation science? And it's not just for theorists, it's actually for real world people. Because of the learning healthcare system movement. We just heard about this from Paul and Adrian and others. So I think, just to recap, there was a National Academy of Medicine, formerly Institute of Medicine report that came out in 2012 that basically outlined a framework for what is a learning healthcare system. So this is sort of my English version of what I think they sort of distilled from this report was: leverage existing big data to deploy and evaluate innovations faster and cheaper, and be able to actually evaluate, do comparative effectiveness studies, and not have to survey patients using 3-hour surveys. Aligning the science, though, with the clinical priority goals of the healthcare system. So actually doing some research that the healthcare system leaders really want to utilize and put back, and that's the implementation piece. Conduct more rapid and efficient studies. But here's the challenge, and this is why we need implementation scientists at all levels of the spectrum. Learning healthcare system conversations I've had mostly have been about the data. They focused on how to get the data. That is important. Data standardization is absolutely vital. We have a query center in San Francisco. It's all they do is data standardization with OMOP. That's their goal. But we need also, in addition to that, quality improvement strategies to take that data and package it to providers so they understand what's going on or what's not going on, and be able to tweak and improve practice on a day-to-day basis. The missing piece are the quality improvement strategies. Why do we need quality improvement strategies? Because there are, I would say, 4 different types of major barriers often facing the day-to-day practitioners when they really want to do the right thing and implement these wonderful interventions and these best practices. We have quality gaps across systems. So you may have you may have a couple of early adopter sites which you want to start with, which is great, but the majority of sites and majority of practices out there don't have oftentimes the resources or the leadership to be able to sort of take the helm and say, hey, we're going to do this best practice, this evidence-based intervention. Providers have competing demands. I mean, in a sense, in terms of quality improvement strategies, it's always about adding something to their plate. We're also talking about de-implementation strategies, and more recently in Query about how do we actually take things off their plate. And then limited external validity. We have these wonderful randomized clinical trials, and of course the work that's going to be done with Cornette and other places are going to change that, but small select patient samples. They don't look like the patients you really see. And then the misalignment with organizations and policies. So you can have this wonderful line of research in one area that's very important, but might be too specific. Whereas the VA, for example, may be saying, hey, we need some research on best practices for curbing the opioid addiction. So, but you've been focusing on another area more specific. And it's not your fault, but it's just essentially aligning the right type of intervention at the right time with the right priorities. So the ways in which we can reduce that bottleneck are really in 4 different ways. Thinking about quality improvement or implementation strategies in lower resourced sites. So taking that intervention that you have, that wonderful intervention, and adapting it so that a site in rural places can actually use it. In addition, thinking about strategies for provider engagement, and I'll go into what types of implementation strategies really work at that provider self-efficacy and motivation to help them adopt evidence-based practices. Have treatments that actually generalize to, let's say, more rural sites or inner city sites. And to have actually the ability to use big data to actually monitor in a valid way to scale up and spread of these evidence-based practices. So that's what we hope to do. Quality improvement strategies. This is really the crux of why we study implementation science. Implementation science is a multidisciplinary field. It has recently also been really evolving to be part of the quality improvement movement and some of the lean work that's been done in hospitals as well. But it's really a multidisciplinary field in many ways, and it makes it exciting. But the goal of implementation science is to create strategies that are highly specified, systematic processes used and tested often at a clinic or system level to help providers implement effective practices. So most of our interventions we've probably worked with are about patient-level interventions. Implementation strategies are provider-level interventions or team-based or team-level interventions to help those providers actually implement the type of interventions you want them to use. So the difference, and this is really the distinction between T1 and T2 research versus the implementation T3 and T4 is when you're doing efficacy trials, you control the providers. You are basically training those providers and those providers work for you. When you know you're doing an implementation study, when you're actually working with community-based providers who are not under your leadership, who are not under your rubric of supervising, and you're basically needing to train them in order to implement your effective practice in routine care. And that sort of arm's length is key to why we need implementation strategies. Providers are not going to always do what you tell them to do, and that's probably important because they have competing demands, they may have other worries, and they may have other needs as well. Implementation science is about aligning what the frontline providers' competing demands are with what you can do in your clinical intervention. So these are examples of some implementation or quality improvement strategies used particularly in our Quality Enhancement Research Initiative program. So Query is a national network of about 15 centers now, and I think we're also up to about an additional 15 what I call smaller partnered evaluation centers. But these 15 centers are around the country, and their goal is to be laboratories for testing different quality improvement strategies. They actually range in terms of simple and easy to use, in terms of relatively low cost, heavy focus on training, provider training, like replicating effective programs, which originated from the CDC, or academic detailing, to more complex types of implementation or quality improvement strategies that really involve a lot of work at the bottom up with frontline providers and leadership. And I would say one of the pinnacle examples is Lisa Rubinstein's evidence-based quality improvement, which is really a combination of rigorous training as well as packaging and manualization of an intervention with actual lean principles, like doing plan, do, study, act cycles, or using data and creating registries to do day-to-day quality improvement inside the clinic. So it's much more intensive, where you have a consultant working with those frontline providers to get something implemented in routine care. And there are other types of implementation strategies you may have heard about. Community engagement is one. The Ken Wells and Loretta Jones used community engagement to scale up and spread depression treatment interventions in greater LA. That's a type of implementation strategy that involving community members. Learning collaboratives are also very popular particularly in types of psychosocial interventions. And then facilitation and unlearning are really popular for areas where you're trying to get providers to work together on decision making, and especially for lung cancer screening or other types of procedures that do require some clinical decision making. So I'm going to talk about the implementation, or I would say quality improvement implementation research roadmap, and how this is sort of a way of framing how to think about getting from your effectiveness studies, your efficacy studies, your observational studies to implementation studies. And this roadmap is really more of not only a heuristic for thinking about your own research trajectory. I'll give you an example of what we've done in our team, but also as a way of thinking about how to actually approach this when you talk to a health system leader in general. You first want to start with identifying what the gaps are and what are some of the most important gaps from the perspective of the leaders of the healthcare system. That's where you get your big data, getting your big data and figuring out where are the gaps in quality. Determine then what drives that variation in quality, study the positive deviance, identify effective practices. The third stage is deploying quality improvement strategies. That's where you basically understand from parts 1 and 2 to get to the point, okay, what do I do? Learning from those positive deviance, learning from the best practices, and taking that and sort of essentially bottling it and try to figure out what the secret sauce is, and that's the implementation strategy, and then help other frontline providers implement that effective practice. So I'll talk about this in a context of quality of medical care for chronic mental disorders. So this is an example from our studies that we've done by our research team about 10 years ago, and we presented this to leadership at the University of Pittsburgh. And basically at the time, there was a concern about underdiagnosis of bipolar disorder. And we made a concern front and center by showing that in the VA healthcare system, people with bipolar disorder were racking up a lot of diagnoses for chronic medical conditions. So oftentimes the focus was just on essentially their mental health issues, but we told them we need to focus on their physical health issues. Bipolar disorder, being one of the serious mental illness in the serious mental illness family, is also associated with almost a 25-year reduction or years of potential life loss due to these types of chronic medical conditions, especially hypertension, diabetes, the ones that are also essentially attributed to heart disease. So we made this front and center as our argument why we need to have a focus area in bipolar disorder. So we showed leadership at the time there was a gap in outcomes, and it was attributed to these chronic medical conditions. We also showed there was a gap in the quality of care received by people with bipolar disorder in the VA region that we worked in. And the gap primarily was not in terms of medications, which were relatively easy to dispense, and this is in the VA, but it was the post-hospitalization visits. But we found that actually to mediate or to sort of mitigate that gap, we were able to do phone contacts for visits. And so the disparities between African Americans and whites in terms of fewer African Americans getting a post-hospitalization visit actually disappeared if you counted phone contacts. And so they tried to use more telephone contacts, and we found out that was a little bit better for people with transportation issues. So we had a gap in quality, we had a potential solution to it. So we figured, okay, what do we do to build a best practice around getting people engaged in their care after hospitalization? So that got to our next step. So we dug into research and did literature reviews and found really the folks out in Washington at Group Health at the time developed the collaborative chronic care model. And we found, gee, it's a great model to be able to proactively identify people at risk and manage their chronic illness. So we identified the use of effective practices. So what we did was we took the chronic care model and we adapted it. And we basically, and this is a definition of, and sort of, again, in English, what chronic care model is supposed to do. It uses clinical data to monitor patients, tailor appropriate treatment, and self-management strategies. I always think the learning healthcare system model is sort of the chronic care model, sort of blown up or on steroids. Essentially, it's the same idea, using data to proactively identify who's in trouble, help them, and try to build in some sustainable self-management or quality improvement for these individuals. A meta-analysis of chronic care model studies for mental disorders back in 2012 showed significant clinical improvements in both physical and mental health outcomes, and for the most part at a little to no net cost. The cost, though, was over a 3-year period, cost neutrality. So that was a little hard to sell to some of the insurance companies, but we were able to sell it to large health systems like the VA. So we adapted this model to help people with bipolar disorder at the time, and we've expanded it since to other mental disorders. But we started with bipolar illness, given the leadership desire to look at that at the University of Pittsburgh. So we created guidelines that focused on cardiovascular risk factors for people with bipolar disorder for their general medical as well as mental health providers. We created a care management physician description that focused on registry tracking and general medical provider liaison work and sort of alerting providers if something was wrong. And we had that care manager provide self-management psychotherapy that focused on tailored psychotherapy around understanding your symptoms, but how to actually use exercise and diet control as ways of coping with the symptoms. So the marriage between sort of your generic wellness, behavior change work with the idea, hey, it can also help your bipolar symptoms. The program was called Life Goals at the time. So we found that in over 7 RCTs with 1,200 participants, we showed that we were able with this program to reduce depressive symptoms and improve health-related quality of life. We also showed in one study that it also reduced blood pressure. In this study, this was a national study focused on the National Network of Depression Centers. In 6 months, we saw a clinically significant decrease in the PHQ-9 scores as well. And it ended up being in a national registry of evidence-based practices in SAMHSA. I want to sort of step aside, though, and talk about another area of positive in use of positive deviance. So you heard about the collaborative care model, which was really one study, one type of intervention. But what do you have a bunch of interventions in a health system and you want to pick the best ones? This is an example of how you can actually manage and get the best ideas from positive deviance in a national healthcare system like the VA. This program is called the Diffusion of Excellence, and it was launched 2 years ago in the VA as a means to get frontline providers to actually compete to get the best ideas around essentially putting in their best practices. And then essentially there was a media platform, a social media platform for them to apply and say, I have this best practice in pharmacy management, or I have this best practice in health behavior change. Then the top 40 were selected, and then subject matter experts in the VA nationally narrowed it down to the top 20. The top 20 went through a virtual VA Shark Tank that was actually managed by, I would say, about half a dozen VA national leaders. These were regional leaders. These were essentially the health plan leaders who essentially bid on which of the best practices that they would implement at their site. So they had to put money on the table and say, I will invest in your best practice if you can come and help us implement it at our sites. So this was a brilliant program. The developer of it was Sharif El-Nahal, who's now the Director of Quality, Safety, and Value in the VA at the time. We're also conducting an inquiry and evaluation of this program to better understand how to do this in other healthcare systems as well. So these are kind of an example of the types of promising practices that got implemented through this Shark Tank program in about a couple years ago. So what resulted was from this was everything from procedural best practices, such as direct access to audiology and optometry appointments, as opposed to going through frontline provider, primary care provider gatekeeping. There also was a couple of them involving nurse care management visits, and pharmacy care management. So a lot of them were kind of, I would say, simple tweaks to an administrative process or an information system, but some of them were also involving coordinated care, like the chronic care model, but more streamlined. So we have these best practices, the chart change, we have the, the studies, but you can build all this infrastructure, and then we assume we build these things and say, okay, we're ready to implement, let's do it. And then we have to then think about the psychology around implementation science and naturally quality improvement. There's a psychology to this, scale up and spread. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to think about what are some quality improvement strategies we can use to implement the collaborative care model for mood disorders, for mental disorders. So we picked two of them because we liked them in terms of what they were focusing on. Replicating effective programs is a quality improvement strategy that focuses on provider training and getting provider buy-in at the beginning. Facilitation is maintaining that provider buy-in throughout the process by which you're trying to get them to implement your favorite best practice. So we did a multi-site randomized trial in Michigan and Colorado. And we compared the effectiveness of rep training focused, frontline provider in the beginning focused with rep plus ongoing facilitation to see if the added cost of facilitation made a difference in the uptake of a chronic care model for bipolar disorder. We looked at the number of collaborative care sessions, which were really an important indicator of whether or not the collaborative care model was being sustained, and of course, some patient outcomes as well. So this is a model. These are the quality improvement strategies as they appear. Replicating effective programs is really front-loaded around getting frontline providers, the clinicians involved at the beginning. There is a stakeholder input process where you talk to frontline providers and ask them, what are some of your pain points? How can we resolve these? What are your barriers? And adapting an effective practice to address those barriers and basically ensuring that those frontline providers own that collaborative care model. It becomes their model. The implementation phase is standard training and technical assistance and ongoing monitoring, but we added in the external facilitation in the ongoing implementation phase. The pinnacle is the dissemination phase, the outcomes assessments over time, the business case, and the future diffusion and spread. REP was developed to rapidly expand and disseminate HIV prevention interventions back in the 90s in order to curb the rising epidemic of HIV. It's based on social learning theory and Rogers diffusion model. The emphasis is again on the fidelity and frontline provider buy-in at the beginning. The QI strategy facilitation is really coming from mainly the literatures of both quality improvement and also organizational psychology. And that tends to come from areas such as self-efficacy and motivational interviewing. It's kind of interesting how it works that way. So essentially, REP allows for provider ownership of the quality improvement process by adapting and deploying the evidence-based practices, mitigating potential for drift. Why do you care about this? Because people often say, oh yeah, I do integrated care. Oh yeah, I'm doing a chronic care model. And so I always give this analogy. Is it a car? So if you look at all these four things, you can call something different, but they all have the same functions. They all kind of look like different things, but you can probably argue, one could argue a car has wheels, an engine, a steering wheel. You would argue, you would probably say all these are different types of cars. But the question is this a car? So this is where, again, it gets to, oh yeah, I'm doing integrated care. I'm doing collaborative care models. And, you kind of have to look underneath the hood to see exactly what's going on. And it's not their fault. It's just that, we get married to our labels. We like to say we're a learning healthcare system. We like to say we're doing collaborative care, but you just really want to probe a little bit more. So enhanced rep adds facilitation because there's that ongoing point where you might have drift. So people may start all excited, they're going to do the collaborative care model, they have their care manager, they have their registry, but then over time things, competing demands eat up time and things happen. So standard rep, these are the elements, these are the quality improvement strategy elements of standard rep. Think of this as an intervention for providers. You kind of know what you're going to give them. Rep plus external facilitation included a phone call on a regular basis by a facilitator, someone who is an expert in the actual intervention that they're trying to implement and also an expert in implementation science. They did a needs assessment, talked to the provider, got to know them. This provider often was a mental health provider, a social worker at the VA, for example, in charge of implementing a new program. Helped to build local support for that social worker, for that frontline provider. Hey, how can you talk to your mental health clinic lead? Here's some talking points. Here's how you can show it's a win-win for your clinic. Identifying problems and barriers. Oh, I see you don't have enough room to hold self-management sessions. Let's think creatively about where to have that conference room or what conference rooms you can use. Identifying and problem solving and having an action plan. And then also providing that opportunity. Hey, you may want to feed this positive change back to your leadership, or here's some talking points to use. So a lot of good coaching, a lot of good consultation going on. With facilitation, we found essentially that rep plus facilitation was more effective in terms of number of self-management sessions, number of self and care management contacts. And we also showed that it actually led to reduction in the number of ER visits as well, which was kind of a surprise secondary finding. But the scale up and spread of quality improvement strategies also needed to happen in the VA on a national level. So what we did in the VA most recently was used rep and facilitation to help implement Reengage. Reengage is a virtual program. It's kind of a virtual brief care management program. This is one of the 4 studies that we did on homelessness. This was the one focused on prevention of homelessness. And this was, I think, Stefan, you had one of the first studies as well. This was a national study that determined among VA sites not initially responding to a standard implementation strategy, REP, the effect of adding facilitation immediately versus delayed to see if the Reengage program would have improved uptake. This was a 2-arm cluster randomized trial. This wasn't done nationally. This was also done for sites not responding to REP. So we took out the early adopters. They're doing great, wonderful, we'll monitor you over time, but we really were focusing on 89 sites that were just not implementing Reengage care management whatsoever. Reengage was a care management program designed for veterans with serious mental illness at risk of homelessness because they had dropped out of care and had not been seen for at least a year. So remember when we talked about serious mental illness being associated with cardiovascular disease, you need to bring these folks back into the clinic. I mean, they most likely have a lot of different chronic conditions. The mental health provider, usually a social worker or psychologist, was asked they dialed a list of veterans who had not been seen for at least a year to go and find their latest contact information, attempt to contact them and schedule an appointment for care if they needed it, and then document all this on a web-based registry. This was the study design of Reengage. So the non-responsive sites, 89 sites, were then randomized to get enhanced rep or continue with the standard rep. And then after 6 months, the sites that had the standard rep got the enhanced rep with the facilitation. So everyone got something at the end of the day. But what it showed was that essentially, even in 6 months, and it took about 3 months to sort of kick in the facilitation, we had improved uptake of the Reengage program, primarily in attempted contacts and updated documentation. So getting that big data and actually seeing in real time providers actually updating their registry with information and populating it with information about these patients was a sign to us. That was our sign of essentially the program was being used. And it also was fairly cheap. It was basically less than 8 hours per site for a 6-month dose of facilitation. It wasn't that much more expensive, which was great because it was virtual. And again, so we had some movement. But you can see, though, we still had about close to 50% of sites actually not implementing the Reengage care management program. So again, this is sort of at the cheaper end of quality improvement strategies. Rep and facilitation are relatively cheap. Getting into the sites that are still more recalcitrant or have more barriers, you're going to need something more intense. So is external facilitation enough? We were doing a lot of these phone calls with facilitators. We found that it wasn't. We found that, again, half of the sites were still not responding. We needed an internal agent to basically be at the site, physically located at that site to help that frontline provider and engage with leadership. So we basically developed the Enhanced Rep 2.0, which not only included an external facilitator, but internal facilitation. And this was really bringing in principles of lean and principles of quality improvement. Essentially, it was an on-site provider who basically was a clinical manager with direct reporting line to leadership and protected time to basically be a quality improvement officer to implement clinical workflow improvements that would enhance the uptake of the intervention itself. So they worked on, they were the people you picked in your clinic that got things done. But the key was they were not the champions of the intervention you're trying to implement. Otherwise, it would just be, oh, you're the poster child for life goals, or you're the poster child for collaborative care. They were seen as sort of the neutral third party, but not an advocate, but essentially a facilitator to help those frontline providers who were enthusiastic about implementing collaborative care, but they were also had the ear of leadership. Internal facilitators, you kind of know them when you see them. It's hard to sort of, this is the best way of explaining them. But we did this study then, we expanded our study, this is outside the VA, but we wanted to study this in community-based practices in Michigan and Colorado. So we essentially designed essentially a sequential multiple assignment randomized trial for this. Implementation science is one of those types of sciences where you can do a study like with a SMART trial, because essentially you don't want to waste the expensive time and resources implementing at sites that are already going to do the work, they're early adopters. You want to get to those later adopters. And using a SMART trial design, you can get to those later adopters. So among sites not initially responding to REP to implement a collaborative care model, sites receiving external and internal facilitation together versus sites getting an external facilitator phone call alone would have improved 12-month patient outcomes and improved uptake of collaborative care. So this is our ongoing study. We have essentially using this SMART design, and SMART designs have primarily been used in clinical trials for patient treatments. This is one of the first times it's been used for an implementation or a quality improvement strategy. The treatment options, quote unquote, are the implementation strategies, the quality improvement strategies. They're restricted based on the responsiveness of the site. So if the site is not doing anything in collaborative care, they get randomized. If the site is basically, and we're monitoring it using web-based registries, if they're doing collaborative care, then we leave them alone. So it's really the informed development of a sequencing of what implementation strategies you would use to ratchet up to sites that would be increasingly needing the resources, the time, and so forth, because they're more of the later adopter sites. So this is our SMART design that we in the middle of right now. So we started with 80 sites. We define non-responsiveness as not having less than 10 out of 20 patients at the site actually getting any sort of collaborative care, life goals program, self-management program. We took those non-responsive sites and we randomized to added external facilitation or external plus internal facilitator. We then waited another 6 months. If they're still non-responsive, we then randomized them again, and then we followed them for another 12 months, and then we're at the stage now where we're looking at the final data. So it's a very exciting SMART trial. These are fun trials to do. They're also wickedly complex, and that's why I hired a good statistician. So just some lessons learned, and I'll take some questions and answers, but I wanted to just really hone in on a couple things. Implementation science is not just about theory, it's about rolling up your sleeves and getting frontline providers and leadership involved and aligned to do some wonderful work. There's also needing to show the return on investment to leadership. That has to happen. Providers and frontline providers are really the leaders here too. They're the ones leading from the middle. Let them own the quality improvement process and the adaptation. Because letting the other person feel that the idea was his or hers is a wonderful way of motivation. That's Dale Carnegie. So again, I also have to be humble as a researcher in saying that we know what we don't know. We're not exactly rocket scientists, but hey, you can just keep working with the right people and you can get there. So I'll just, these are my acknowledgements and disclosures, and I'll take questions if there's time. Thank you.
Amazing body of work, and it was really interesting to hear about all the things that you guys have gotten done. And I'm in the midst of trying to do an implementation type trial right now, and am immersed in the challenges. And so I was wondering, I noticed when you were talking about frontline providers, you didn't necessarily mean physicians, and you kind of toggled back and forth with different people. So we're doing practice facilitation out in the community, so in rural health clinics. And some of the times that we go in, we try to identify a practice champion, and that's generally not the physician. And it varies from practice to practice who that might be. So I'm curious to know your opinion on how important physician engagement is. I have my own opinions about this, but and how you get there, because when we have a practice champion, a lot of time we have to get the permission from the physicians, but a lot of times they sort of say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, talk to this person, and then they kind of go away. And my gut feeling is that it's not good enough to let them go away, but how do you really keep them engaged in a practical way when they've sort of turfed it to somebody else, who's equally as important, but they kind of walk, I don't know. Anyway, I think you understand the question.
Yeah, that's a really important question about the dynamic between who owns the responsibility and who has the authority on things. I think it's really making sure that because there's always that same old story. You have like the clinic leader or physician saying, yeah, it's great, it's wonderful, go talk to so-and-so, they'll get it done for you. And then that person often is not in the loop about the whole process. And so that's who you want to get engaged first. And then make sure that it's not a burden to them. And then also use facilitation, train and consult and coach that frontline provider to be your communicator back to that physician. So you're not having to sort of talk to two different people, let them do the talking. That's what we found in real life. But that happens a lot where you have this kind of voluntold problem. People get voluntold to do things. So you really want to make sure that whoever's been voluntold is actually owning it. It's their thing. Yeah. So.
Love the work. Have you considered the commercial potential of what you're doing, maybe outside of a healthcare setting, maybe in a for-profit setting? Do you have a sense that organizations would be willing to pay your organization to come in and help them implement some, effective practices?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think part of it, because a lot of this work was developed in the federal government space, in the VA, there's a limitation about what could be done. I think in terms of the potential for scale up and spread of these implementation strategies, we're seeing that already, and especially with the query programs. And the one thing too is I'm not married to necessarily saying you gotta do rep, you gotta do facilitation. That bubble diagram was deliberate because there are a variety of different implementation strategies, and my goal is to increase the pie, not sort of thin the slice. So I want people to look at these as opportunity. There's a lot of work been done on implementation strategies, and you can learn from that work. That's a good point.
Great presentation. My question has to do with the sort of organic nature of what you're doing. And so I understand what you're doing still occurs within the research context. So even the non-responders in this trial are clinics or sites who are going to be part of whatever it is that you're proposing or have agreed to. How do you organically spread best practice? That is to institutions, so divorced from the research environment. How do we sort of move that frontier forward and get changes that way?
No, that's a great question. I would say let the health system leadership and that level own the process and buy into, hey, we need to implement these best practices. We need to invest in the quality improvement strategies and the manpower, people power to do the facilitation, the rep. That's really the best way. We're lucky in VA because we have a line of work that's not considered research, as long as it's being directed and done by VHA clinical operational leadership. And so it never touches an IRB. We work in that space to some extent, but anything we do when we do a lot of extra data collection, I run it through the IRB, and ironically, the University of Michigan IRB considered our ADEPT trial non-research as well. So I think we're still trying to figure out how to play in this world, but we like register in clinicaltrials.gov, but we're not a research study, so go figure. But we're trying to work that part out too, but anyway. So.
Great presentation, Amy, thank you. In nursing, when we try to implement things that we know work, on a nursing unit in a hospital, the biggest barrier is lack of time. There's not enough time to do this. There's no one person that can, we want all the staff to implement something. So you talked about de-implementation strategies, or how to get things off their plates. Could you speak about that just a little bit? Thanks.
Sure. So we have a query center in Puget Sound in the Seattle VA that is focused on basically providing audit and feedback and academic detailing to basically give providers kind of the opportunity to say no to ordering a test that's not needed. And it's primarily, I'm seeing it primarily with specific types of clinical interventions, such as lung cancer screening follow-ups and things like that, that are mainly for physicians. But I'll tell you, to be honest, it's a very new area. It's very new. And I think a lot of it is complicated by, I think, our world of defensive medicine, but it's also complicated by just, oh, we've always done it this way. And, you know, I've always done it this way. So it really takes some more thinking in using quality improvement strategies that use process maps like Lean to maybe try to take something off the provider's plate to make things more efficient, as well as essentially using audit and feedback to also help with that as well, saying, hey, you know, I notice you are ordering a lot of these tests, you know, you don't need to do that for these situations, and giving providers an opportunity to have that, for lack of a better term, safe space to say no. So it's still an emerging area. We need to do more. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. This is kind of a mechanical question, but each time I looked at this, like, I mean, I see all these names up here, and I'm trying to think, if you're thinking about doing a project like this to change with external facilitation and internal facilitation, some practice, on average, in some general way, how much FTE, external facilitator time, do you need to hire to assist one institution? Let's call it a medical center, a hospital in the VA system for now. Mm-hmm. How much FTE time from within that institution do you need to get the medical center director to say, yes, I will protect this amount? Is it something where you can say, you know, half an FTE from my institution and 4 hours a week from yours, and we got a chance, as long as there's, assuming the stakeholders are interested? Or is it really something where you need a full-time person dedicated to it in the institution and a full-time person who's facilitating from the outside? Because if we're going to propose these kinds of projects going forward, we need a little bit of a kind of a rough sense of what to budget.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there has been a wonderful article published on how much it costs to use evidence-based quality improvement. That's the most expensive one. That's the lean facilitation, training, all that. And I think they costed it out to approximately $100,000 for a VISN, not a site, but a VISN. That's a Veterans Integrated Service Network. So how many sites are in a VISN? I don't know, like
6, 8.
Yeah. So that's a good rough guesstimate. We haven't done enough work on costing out implementation quality improvement strategies. Essentially, people either throw money at the problem by hiring consultants, or you kind of cobble together your own grants. You know, it's really hard to say REP. When CDC did REP, it cost them $400 per intervention, $400,000 per intervention. That was a lot of money, but a lot of that was they costed out federal time, federal employees, everything from emails all the way to actually writing the intervention. So I don't think I have a precise answer. It depends, but anytime you're doing something for the first time, it's always going to be more expensive. And you want to, I would say rough guess, have like, you know, at least have a full-time coordinator with maybe 20%, I'm just guessing off the top of my head, 20% clinical person in that facility just to jumpstart things. But we found in our facilitation study in Reengage was that the cost actually went down once you took out all the startup costs of building the intervention, adapting it, writing the manuals, writing a training program. Once you kind of get that out of the way as a research unit, the facilitation was not that costly at all. It was like basically like about 8 hours per site for a 6-month dose of facilitation by phone. So those are numbers I'm throwing out.
Thank you so much. Your presentation has obviously generated tremendous enthusiasm, and I would love to let the questions go on, but I also promise to keep us on track, and I hope you'll be able to stick around a little bit afterwards for lunch, and if others would like to speak with you individually, I think that would be great. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks.
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce our final speaker on a very energizing morning. Dr. Mike Mugavero needs very little introduction for this crowd, but he is a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases. He is co-leader of our Center of AIDS Research, and has also taken on a very important role for a number in the room and others in co-leading our T32 and K training programs, and we really appreciate his innovations in developing new infrastructure and ideas in the outcomes research space. Mike has published over 180 papers. He has been internationally recognized for his work in AIDS, quality of care, and patient-reported outcomes. In addition to his great research, he's also won teaching awards for his clinical services and does great clinical care and has been recognized for that as well. And it's really a pleasure to have him. I should also add that he's a great bridge with our other speakers because he's trained at Vanderbilt in medical school and he went to Duke for fellowship. I don't think you were at University of Michigan though.
I went to Notre Dame, so that's kind of
oh, no.
diabolically opposed.
Welcome.
So thank you so much, Ken. Really appreciate the invitation to join, and thanks everyone for sticking around. Really honored to join the speakers today and thank Adrian, Paul, Amy for setting the stage so nicely for the work that I'm going to talk about. So we've heard a lot of really wonderful big picture talks about health system implementation science. And what I plan to share is a 10-year journey that we've been on, focusing on one chronic disease, HIV, but as an example of studying other areas, other chronic diseases. And I think to the question that came at the end, hopefully going to talk about how do you extend some of these findings from the health system out into the community and translate and implement some of these findings into practice, into research, some of the work we're trying to do now. So learning objectives for CME purposes, that might differ a bit from what's on the form, but really want to give an operational framework to study engagement and care. And I use engagement and care very specifically and distinct from access to care, and I'll make that distinction in terms of how we've operationalized that. How do you measure care engagement? And we'll focus a lot on the idea of within the health system, missed visits, first arrived or kept visits, capturing different behaviors. The prognostic value of missed clinic visits, so that this kind of very simple marker has great prognostic value for future care engagement and health outcomes, and to share just a couple of health system interventions that can improve care engagement. So relatively low cost interventions. Really enjoyed Amy's talk about quality improvement implementation. I feel like I straddle that world all the time in my work, and also the grassroots. So really my story is going to start with a grassroots study coming out of fellowship at Duke. I'm going to share, but first this idea of engagement and care. And I think the importance of access to care has long been recognized. And historically, access has been thought about these big population-based surveys, large administrative databases, asking questions like, do you have a usual source of care? Have you visited the emergency department in the last 12 months? So kind of these kind of global questions about someone's interface with the healthcare system. So shifting from access to engagement, going from a more global conceptualization of the interface with the healthcare system to more granular processes, more granular measures. Again, hope to share a conceptual framework where using HIV as a model condition for research and practice really is applicable to any chronic disease. I mean, speaking to the idea of having agnostic, I think a lot of these methods, framework approaches really are agnostic to disease, and that these operational definitions are very broadly applicable. So just some background, HIV basics. I know a lot of folks don't necessarily think about HIV infection very much. So a virus that targets the CD4 T cells of the immune system. So this is one of many immune cells in the immune system. As these CD4 cells are depleted over time by the virus in the absence of treatment, someone comes at risk for AIDS-defining opportunistic infections or cancers. So more virus, deplete CD4 count, someone develops clinical AIDS at risk of dying from AIDS-defining events, typically cancers or infections. The viral load is the amount of virus that's circulating in someone's blood. And it's used clinically for both treatment and prevention implications, and research is a really important surrogate outcome measure. And that we've had combination therapy since 1996, first called HAART or highly active antiretroviral therapy, and it really transformed HIV. I mean, probably one of the greatest public health discoveries ever made in terms of the hundreds of thousands of life years saved because of this transforming a uniformly fatal illness into a treatable condition. And so the goals of treatment are to suppress that viral load to what's called undetectable. So a level so low you can't detect it in the plasma, it's in the blood. No one can be cured of HIV yet, but the viral load is undetectable, thereby increasing the CD4, so building back CD4 equals immune system, improving survival, improving quality of life. So I wanted to share a case study because I think it's really important. We talk a lot about now big data, population health, but at the end of the day, it comes down to one patient at a time. And we're talking about intervening with one patient at a time. And I think this is an illustrative case for what we commonly see in the healthcare system and setting, not just with HIV, but in any healthcare setting. So it was a 21-year-old African-American male with diagnosed with HIV in June of 2009. He established care, came to our clinic, started antiretroviral therapy, combination therapy 2 months later. So got into care pretty quickly and had a great response to treatment. So here's his trajectory. He's diagnosed. At diagnosis, has pretty advanced infection. So a CD4 count of 78 would be defined as AIDS. It's less than 200. Viral load was relatively high. Starts therapy a month later, you see a dramatic reduction. That viral load is already 384. His immune system is building back up. Comes back in a few months later. His virus is now undetectable. So it's fully suppressed in the blood. CD4 count continues to increase. And again, in February, comes back 3 months later. So here we are 6 months, from entering care, 8 months from diagnosis. We have someone who has really successfully engaged the healthcare system, started treatment, achieved success in these biomarkers. But then it got more complicated, as it often does. So had sporadic visits, missed visits, and then was lost to care entirely. As often is the case, the clinic tried with our locator information to contact him, couldn't get in touch, couldn't reach him, and he passively returned to care 2 years later. And that's when I first met him, was when he passively returned to care, had weight loss, night sweats, cough, and what's Kaposi sarcoma lesions. This is a malignancy, a skin cancer that's associated with the human herpes virus. So we look at his trajectory. We left off in February of 2010, where he was suppressed and had the CD4 count that was increasing, missed several visits, came back in November, viral load was up, CD4 count had dropped, his immune system was weakening, and then entirely disappeared for 2 years. And then showed up 2 years later. At that time, his viral load had increased dramatically. His CD4 count was again back in that AIDS level. Actually came for a lab-only visit, and I met him in April of 2013, where his viral load was even higher and his CD4 count had dropped further. Actually, beyond having the skin lesions of the Kaposi sarcoma, had it in his lungs as well. Very difficult cancer, very difficult diagnosis. And I think this case is illustrative of something that we see in our clinic every day in HIV. But I think if you're in a primary care clinic, a diabetes clinic, a mental health clinic, we see this all the time, where we have folks intermittently engage with the system, doing well for periods of time, disappear for a whole myriad of reasons, and then either passively come back because of symptoms, illness, other life-changing events that bring them back into care. And so I show this picture, this HIV treatment cascade, because this has become the centerpiece for studying HIV for a long time. And I've kind of shared with you this very individualized trajectory, but the way at a population or public health level HIV has kind of been approached and looked at is that among those living with HIV, estimated 1.2 million people, that about 90% are diagnosed. So testing efforts have been pretty darn good. We've gotten most folks living with infection in the US diagnosed. Where we've really struggled is in this idea of engaged in care. So only half of persons living with HIV in the US are engaged in regular medical care. So this other 50% are out in the community, not in care, not accessing treatment, not receiving benefits of care. Once folks are engaged in care, most are prescribed treatment and the majority are virally suppressed. So once we get down to that end, if folks can get in and stay in care, they do really well. And what's been really interesting is that for the 30 years that we've been studying HIV, there have been hundreds and hundreds of trials comparing how does regimen ABC work compared to regimen XYZ. And we've improved iteratively from 80% suppression to 90% suppression, but these 50% of folks not in care, largely ignored as kind of a service problem. And the science is finally catching up in the last 10 years or so. But again, from a healthcare system perspective, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we've studied this, a framework to study it, and then beyond the health system, how do you interface with the community, with public health, to really understand how folks are engaging in their healthcare. And so this is a snapshot at a moment in time. I think that last case would show us our patient went from diagnosis through these steps to virally suppressed in 6 months. And at a population level, you could say, here's how folks are doing at this snapshot in the moment in time. But for each individual, it's so much more dynamic. Again, for any of us in our healthcare, it's such a dynamic process. So when I first came back to UAB in 2006, on a whiteboard in a conference room, we drew up this kind of blueprint for treatment success and this idea of engagement in medical care. And this idea that following diagnosis, someone has to get the next step of get linked to care. And now in the case of HIV, a lot of times the place of testing and the place of treatment are different. Might not be the same with high blood pressure, diabetes, other conditions, but might be the case where you have to go from one provider to another, or one health setting to another, or from a community testing place, screening place to a clinic. So the first step is getting linked to care, starting antiretroviral therapy and continuing to receive it. So both initiation and persistence on treatment, while staying retained in care, optimizing adherence to improve clinical outcomes. And those clinical outcomes might be CD4, viral load, quality of life, any number, mortality. Re-engagement is intentionally in dashed lines because it wasn't a necessary step. Someone didn't have to drop out to get back into care. But in terms of setting up a framework to study this, we know a lot of folks drop out of care. So we had to have that as part of this process in terms of how do we identify who these folks are, where they are, and identify strategies to bring them back into care. Again, really dovetails nicely with the work at the VA, Amy, that you've done with mental health and re-engagement. So operationalizing that 50% who were not engaged in care, we've kind of broken down saying there's 3 distinct but interrelated steps. So the first is linkage to care, the next is retention in care, and the next is re-engagement. I think also really important is the bidirectionality, that each step impacts earlier steps. So someone's health outcomes influences if they keep coming to the clinic, keep taking the medicine. And so these relationships are not simply a one-way, but bidirectional, dynamic, and changing over time. So now I'm going to come back to where I jumped the gun a little bit. So when I finished fellowship at Duke in 2006, came back and thinking about a bottom-up approach, heard from providers, this is our clinic director, Jim Rapers, a nurse practitioner, a lawyer, director of our clinic, that a lot of our new patients are no-shows. They're not coming for their visits. So we said we can study that, we can measure that, we can evaluate that, and then do something about it. And so we looked at patients who called to establish care. The 1917 is the name of our HIV clinic from 2004 to 2006. And lo and behold, as is typically the case, the providers were right. About a third of new patients who were calling the clinic failed to attend, failed to come in for an initial scheduled visit. And now when someone calls the clinic, we would capture some very basic information. So we could start kind of saying, in terms of who are these folks, who's likely to make it in, who's not likely to make it in. And what we found was there was a trend towards younger patients not making it into the clinic, not getting linked to care. But compared to white males, 80% of whom were linked to medical care, minority males, in our setting predominantly African-American, minority and white women, again, African-American women, were significantly less likely to get linked to care, to attend that visit within 6 months of the phone call. Compared to those with private insurance, 83% made it in. Those with public insurance on insurance, less likely to make it in. And then finally, the days of the longer the time from that phone call to the appointment, the less likely someone was to get into care. So the idea that on average it was 4 weeks, and how much happens in someone's life from now to 4 weeks from now that might impact their ability to make it into a visit. But the longer that time was, less likely someone was to get linked to care. So this was pretty cool. For me, I'm here coming out of fellowship. In August, these folks have this great idea. By December, we've got a brief report accepted, and I've got an engaged healthcare team that's into CQI and doing that kind of work. That was around Malcolm Marler, who was our clinic chaplain, brought together nurses, social workers, doctors, patients, clients, consumers of care to talk about, here's a problem, what do we do? And we launched this program in January of 2007. And the first thing that jumped out to us was 4 weeks is way too long for someone to wait from calling to coming in for a visit. So we're going to add an orientation visit within 5 days of the call to the clinic. And the median time is 3 days. And what we did was, in terms of thinking about cost and how we're going to do this, was this is now coordinated by social work services. So historically, someone would call, 4 weeks later would come in, have an hour social work visit, have an hour medical visit, get their labs and go, and I would bring them back pretty quickly to see them in follow-up. So now we uncoupled those visits. So the social work visit became the orientation visit, where we were able to do a semi-structured interview, a psychosocial patient-reported outcome questionnaire, and get baseline labs. So won't go into great detail in my talk today, but James Willig, who I've worked with for the last 10 years, with his kind of software development work, this was the first proof of concept for the PRO platform that's now been launched throughout a number of clinics within the UAB health system, rheumatology, palliative medicine, GYN, pediatric neurosurgery. And the beauty of this was, by uncoupling this, we got folks in within 3 days, got all kinds of information from them in terms of housing, marital status, depression, anxiety, substance use, stigma, social support, as well as baseline labs. So that now when someone comes to see me for my visit, I know so much about the context of who they are, their life, potential barriers to care. And this is a pre-post analysis, so it's a non-scientific, non-randomized design, but we saw dramatic reduction in terms of the no-show rate. So after launching this intervention, we dropped from a 31% no-show rate to an 18% no-show rate, became a quality indicator for us for the last decade, and has oscillated between 80% and 95% show. So, historically, we hovered around 60, 70%, 75% show, went up to 80, 95% show. So, good suggestion that this intervention worked, was successful, was implemented in the clinic successfully. And then the CDC has a compendium of best practices for interventions for linkage and retention in care. And this was named one of a handful of interventions to receive that designation. And thinking about, for this team, right, this wasn't researchers, this was a team of chaplains, social workers, patients, nurses that kind of came together with this, really empowering. I mean, in terms of owning this and feeling, the validation that they created this, they built this. And so a lot of the work that we're doing now with Project Connect, I've had more requests for information about this than anything else, is saying, can we deploy this? How do we deploy this in terms of having these PROs available, web-based, having systems of data capture? So thinking about, we've got this evidence-informed intervention, we have a lot of folks that want to use it. Our next step is, how do we deploy this in a way that we can both capture data, study, measure, and determine, is the impact that we observed more broadly applicable in other populations and settings? So that's kind of some of the future directions we're going with this work. So the next step was looking at missed visits. And this is probably the most impactful study I imagine that I'll ever do. It wasn't published in JAMA or in New England Journal or Annals. And it was such a simple question, but has really had a big impact on our field and kind of the work that we've done going forward. So, beyond having a challenge getting into the clinic, a lot of patients miss visits after they first come into care. So a really simple question, saying among 543 patients, relatively small sample, coming into our care, newly diagnosed, they made it in for a first visit between 2000 and 2005, what was the impact of having at least one no-show visit that first year on their long-term mortality? Start a survival clock at 12 months. And what we found was there was a 3-fold increased mortality risk. So by no showing for one visit, your mortality was relatively equivalent to coming in with immunologic aids, a CD4 count below 200. And the message of this back to providers was, we're not suggesting this early no-show is causally responsible for someone dying subsequently, but wow, in terms of a prognostic marker telling us this is someone who might be at risk, this is someone who might have more going on in their life that requires attention to understanding and intervening upon, that's a pretty powerful prognostic marker. And again, a small study, but impactful. I mean, later that year, the HIV guidelines came out and added a new recommendation based upon that study of 500 patients and a VA-based study saying that the importance of adherence to care has to be focused upon rather than just focusing on adherence to medication. So historically, it's adherence to medicines, but if half of folks are not in care, if we don't study adherence to care, we're really missing the population level impact. So I show this now to talk about what does it mean to be engaged in care or retained in care. And so this is an example of 4 different patients. If we think about across the UAB health system, we could kind of make these kind of diagrams for every single patient that comes in and interfaces with our healthcare system. So this was a 12-month period of time, because historically in HIV, folks would come in every 3 months for a visit. So we said a 12-month period of time. We used check boxes to indicate an arrive visit. Someone came and attended, an X box to indicate a no-show visit. Someone didn't call in to cancel their appointment. By convention, historically, canceled or bumped visits, if someone calls ahead, have not been included analytically for research purposes. Huge opportunity, but the idea of someone that's calling in to cancel treated differently than just not showing up for a visit. So operationally, imagine 12 months, these 4 3-month intervals, here's these different patterns, and you say, what does it mean to be engaged within the healthcare system over this time? And here's 5 different measures that have been used in the literature. So different ways to operationalize what does it mean to be retained or engaged in care. So the missed visits one is relatively simple, either as a dichotomous measure, yes versus no, or a count measure. You can go across each patient and say, do they have an X box? If so, how many of them? And kind of calculate that measure. The appointment adherence resonates with medication adherence. So over a total of X number of scheduled visits, how many did someone actually attend? So the attended over the total visits. So for the first patient, you could say they came to 80% of their appointments, second patient a third, last patient came to 100%. The idea of visit constancy is getting around, did someone attend a visit per interval time? So again, historically in HIV, it'd be every 3 months, saying, did someone come to at least one visit every 3 months? So is there a checkbox in each of these 4-month intervals? And you can see for that first patient, they did. They're 100%. Even though they missed that visit, they came in each interval. For that second patient, they only came in 2 of the intervals, so they're 50%. The third came in 75%. They didn't miss any visits, but that third quarter, whether they canceled, whether they weren't scheduled, they didn't have a visit, so they'd be 75%. And the last patient, they had 2 visits, but both in that same interval, so they'd be 25%. Gap in care, very intuitive to providers. Was there 6 months time or some period of time between arrived visits? So you could say for these patients, patients 1 and 3 did not have a gap. The other 2 patients did have a gap of more than 6 months. Then the HRSA-HAB measure is a quality improvement measure. So it's used for quality purposes and says, did someone attend at least 2 visits that are 90 days apart in a 12-month period? So you could say the first 3 patients, despite having very different kind of profiles and patterns, all 3 of them attended 2 visits that were not within the same 90-day window. So this quality indicator would say patient A, B, and C were all retained in care, whereas the last patient, despite having 2 visits, they were both in that same 90-day period, so you'd say they were not retained in care. So just kind of breaking down, how do you operationalize from a health system perspective, looking at care? We have lots and lots of care visits. How do you operationalize and break down? What does it mean to be engaged? Broadly speaking, there are measures that include missed visits, and that includes that missed visit measure, the appointment adherence, or the flip is the no-show rate. And then there are those that are based solely upon arrived visits or attended visits. So that idea of constancy, coming per interval, a gap in care, HRSA-HAB, or another HHS measure that are used. And I think what's critical to point out, thinking about health systems and health systems research, is that typically health systems uniquely capture missed visits. I think most administrative systems capture when someone shows up, a claim is made, so you capture the presence of attending and arriving. But health systems are uniquely positioned, to my knowledge, to really study and understand how to missed visits have an impact in terms of patient health and population health. So this was a study we did. It was before doing a 6-site intervention trial to improve retention in care. So we looked at the 12 months before launching the intervention trial. We had over 10,000 patients across 6 different sites and said, we're going to take those 10,000 patients, draw their little line with all their visits, and categorize them based upon how they would perform according to these metrics. So same patients, same visits. And what you find is very striking differences in whether you'd say someone is engaged or not based upon how you define engagement. So on average, patients had 1.5 no-show visits. Only 1/3 came to all their appointments, had 0 no-shows. So if you said to be an engaged patient, you can't have any no-shows, you'd say 1/3 of the patients were engaged during this 12-month period. For visit adherence, again, you see a broader distribution. It's just kind of extenuates the no-show in terms of the data, but 1/3 are not retained in care. When you go to this kind of kept visit measure, did someone come at least once every 4 months? And we use 4 months instead of 3 months because practice patterns change. We're seeing folks less frequently. And what you found was only half of patients arrived at least once in each 4-month interval. You say half of them are retained. When you go to the gap, you would say that 2/3 are retained, because they did not have a gap in care. And by the HRSA-HAB, that 2 visits 90 days apart, you'd say that 77% were retained. So again, the same exact 10,000 patients, the same exact visit data, kind of just measuring them different ways, you would get very different kind of answers in terms of, did this patient engage in the health system over the last 12 months? And so looking at a correlation matrix, and probably not surprising based upon those findings, were that the missed visit measures, very highly correlated, very high correlation coefficients for the missed visits, visit adherence, whether counter dichotomous. Kept visit measures, similarly, very highly correlated. But what was interesting was that the correlation coefficients were much lower across the missed visit and kept visit measures. So again, same visits, just measuring them differently, these correlation coefficients are much lower. So the next question we asked was, how about predictors of these different measures? And we see a lot about disparities in care, disparities in HIV care. Are there disparities in engagement in care based upon these measures? And for simplicity, there's different models, and didn't want to go into the details. Green means better retained, red means worse retained. So looking at these missed visit measures, you would say older patients, men, and white patients relative to African Americans are better retained in care. You'd say there are clear healthcare disparities in terms of who is engaged in care. But if you then look at these same patients, same data, same visits, and base it upon how many visits did they attend or arrive to, you see the same findings in terms of older patients versus younger patients, but women compared to men, in one instance, actually performed better. And African Americans compared to whites had the same. So really begging this question, same patients, same data, is that are missed and kept visits capturing different aspects of engagement and care? And I think that they really are. There's something different about getting to an appointment at some interval and some frequency versus missing appointments. Thought a lot about, the role of different structural factors versus psychosocial factors. How does having housing, transportation, relative to your stigma, resiliency, coping skills. But I think this is a really important area for study in terms of really understanding. These are capturing different aspects of folks engaging with the system. What does it mean to miss, and what does it mean to keep, and how do we intervene to improve them? So what was really striking was that despite them seeming to capture a different aspects of engagement and care, they all were strongly associated with viral suppression. So when we looked at how did these different measures of engagement and care correlate with viral load suppression as an outcome measure, all of them strong, significant associations. So the better retained, more likely virally suppressed, varying discriminatory capacity based on C statistic, and not surprisingly, those that are dichotomous were less discriminatory. Those with more continuous measures had better discrimination. But the idea that there's no gold standard, so they're all measuring something valuable. They're capturing something meaningful and valuable, but that missed and kept visit measures are tapping into something different. So subsequently, we went on and did the intervention trial. And this was through the CDC, these 6 sites. And phase 1 was a clinic-wide intervention, a really simple intervention. So put up posters, put up brochures. There was a training for the clinic staff, everyone, to emphasize engagement and care from the front desk. It's great to see you today. It's been a while. How are you doing? Through the visit, nursing, vital signs to the lab. So creating this clinic culture for retention and care and evaluated by a pre-post study design. And the phase 2 was a patient level behavioral intervention. So identifying patients who had poor retention by missed visits in the previous year and enrolling them in this study was a pretty simple intervention in terms of enhanced personal contact. So personal reminder calls, 7 and 2 days before a visit and within 1 or 2 days of a missed visit. And it was the same person every time. And when someone enrolled in the trial, they met that person, they developed a relationship, so they knew who this person was. It wasn't a random person, it wasn't a robocall. It was a person and the same person every time. And there was a 2-session skill buildings on problem solving, communication, organization, and did this multi-site RCT to evaluate phase 2. And so what we found for the phase 1 was that it improved clinic-wide visit adherence. Pretty modest, a 3% improvement. There were some better improvements for newer re-engaging patients, those with high viral loads and low CD4, so some priority populations. But relative to the cost, a pretty low intensity, low cost intervention to do. And our colleagues at CDC did some cost analyses and demonstrating that by improving the clinical efficiency, by having more kept visits and fewer no-show visits, the average clinic would increase their revenue by $24,000. So it would actually improve clinic revenue because it's relatively low cost and you're getting more encounters that are attended and folks there. So the phase 2 for improved visit adherence, again, modest improvements, but the overall retention and care increased by 5% based upon visit adherence. Improved among, again, the populations that seem to be having the greatest challenging. African Americans, women, those lacking private health insurance had the biggest impact of this intervention. And in terms of the cost analysis, the cost per additional patient retained in care, around $4,000. So a relatively modest cost to retain one additional patient in medical care. So I want to talk now about some of this work we've done, both in a quality frame, in a research frame, and how we're now working to kind of translate this into the community and extend this beyond the academic health system with community partners. So the Alabama Regional Quality Group is a group of 8 different HIV clinics around the state of Alabama, provide care to between 80 and 90% of persons living with HIV who are in medical care. And the group, down here you see, the quality group management exists to ensure that those living with HIV/AIDS in the state receive quality health care through collaboration of healthcare partners throughout the state. The collaboration aims to continuously improve the quality of HIV care consistent with recognized national standards and current research. And this group has come together and agreed upon aggregate data we want to capture for viral load suppression, for missed visits, for retention and care, meet quarterly, aggregate data, share data. And one of the things has been this no-show percentage. So across these 8 different clinics, it ranges as low as 18% clinic-wide no-show to as high as 32%. This is a colleague down in Montgomery, Ashley Tarrant, shared this slide. But this has become a kind of target for us, saying there's challenges and these clinics can improve clinic-wide in reducing their no-show rate. We have this evidence-based intervention that we could deploy. And so there's a lot of discussion about, well, how do we do this? How are we going to deploy this? Can we implement this trial through the network? And one thing we've talked to them about, because one of the challenges were we don't have the resources to do this for everyone. We can't call everyone, doesn't make sense, was looking at data from the CNIX cohort. This is an 8-site clinical cohort across the country, over 20,000 patients, and wanted to look at missed visits for risk stratification. So the idea of, can we predict who's going to miss their next visit based upon past behavior? And we actually tried to do more sophisticated prognostic modeling, adding PROs for depression and substance use and all these things. And it turned out that to add that complexity and elements didn't give us that much more prognostic value. And that simply knowing someone's visit behavior in the previous 12 months, we could reasonably predict who was going to miss their next appointment. So about half of the clinic population hadn't missed any visits in the previous year. And they accounted for their no-show risk was 9% for that next visit. So, I mean, pretty low. 35% of the clinic population had missed 1 to 2 visits. Their risk of no-show was 22%, and 15% of the clinic population had missed 3 or more visits, and they had a 35% no-show risk. And all these folks attended and were in the clinic and were in front of you. So here they are, they're here, they've made it to this visit, and we're saying your risk is 9%, 22%, 35% of missing your next visit. So we're in discussions now with the regional quality group about, can we do an implementation science trial? Can we evaluate that CDC retention and care study, but using a tailored intervention? So if you risk stratify and say someone that's had 0 no-shows the previous year, leave them alone. They get no intervention, they're probably gonna do okay on their own. Someone that missed 1 or 2 visits, they get kind of the simple intervention. So those personal reminder calls, those follow-up no-show calls. Someone that's really at higher risk, they've missed a whole bunch of visits, they have a 35% risk, they get that simple reminder call intervention, no-show visit intervention, plus whatever your best practice is. Not gonna try to add something new, but say if you have intensive case management, if you have peer navigator, patient navigator, let's deploy that intervention. So more of a strategy trial, trying to say we have an evidence-based intervention that works. We can pretty easily at the point of care risk stratify who is in most need of the intervention. Can we have a strategy that works to improve both individual but clinic-wide retention and care? So going to step back now from the health system perspective and look more broadly at the interface with the community. And I think, we talked about this work starting in the clinic, going through these trials, now through this clinical network, and now wanting to go back in the interface with the community. And historically speaking, a lot of work in the community was done by community-based organizations in public health, and was a lot of testing work and prevention work. And within the clinic was all the work, once someone was diagnosed, you're linked to care, you're retained in care, you're on treatment, and we're very separate. So the community work and prevention, the clinic work and treatment were really separate. But the idea that, if half of folks are not in care, we've got to think about this interface and how do we bridge the interface between the community and the clinic, both to get folks into care, but those that fall out of care to kind of bring them back into care. And the Jefferson County HIV/AIDS Community Coalition has become a grassroots organization to help us mobilize and try to better bridge the community and the clinic. So in March of 2013, we came together. In January, we convened an Ending AIDS dialogue with stakeholders throughout the state. And after that meeting, folks said, we have all the resources, we have the tools, we have the people, we just need to kind of collaborate, work together, communicate. So starting in March, this group came together, included all the community-based agencies, local public health and state public health, and those two don't always work well together and get along. There's sometimes challenges in that interface, as well as all the clinics that are providing care and the Center for AIDS Research to give some kind of operational research support. And so this was a picture taken early on, and this group, defined goals and wanted to be very broad in our goals and broad in our thinking. So we wanted to improve health outcomes, wanted to enhance prevention, treatment, and research, wanted to improve social and economic justice, foster community collaboration to achieve parity, inclusion, representation, and to identify, evaluate, and apply for alternative sources of funding to maximize sustainability. And this group has met every month since March of 2013, and it's really been a great success. And it's led to a number of different demonstration projects. So AIDS United is a foundation, funded 2 demonstration projects, one to AIDS Alabama, community partner called Living Well. This is a peer navigation-based model for folks tenuously engaged in care, trying to improve their interface at that community clinical interface. The other was Birmingham Access to Care, a community-based case management study done with our partner Birmingham AIDS Outreach. So starting to kind of bridge that interface between the clinic and the community around care engagement. So I come back to now, as a clinic, as a health system, one of the challenges that we faced, and how do we engage our community and public health partners to kind of address that problem. So in terms of our loss to follow-up, in terms of our CQI, going back as long as the clinic has existed for 28, 29 years, what's been amazing is among patients we'd seen in the previous 24 months, we hadn't seen 8 to 12% in the last 12 months. So the idea of the loss to follow-up for 12 months was 8 to 12%. So people we saw in 2010, we didn't see 10% in 2011. And if you look over time, very stable, very consistent, that we lose about 8 to 10% of our patients, 8 to 12% of our patients to care. And it's always begged the question of, are these patients really lost to clinic, or are they truly lost to care? People migrate, they move around, there's other clinics, other places to go, and we haven't systematically had a way to know if someone's not in care at our clinic, are they in care somewhere else? And that all changed with Data to Care. And this is a CDC-led initiative that encourages state and local health departments to use surveillance data for HIV to improve the continuum of care. So, and our coalition kind of spearheaded this. That picture was taken in August 2014, really encouraging the health department to engage in Data to Care. And the way this works is that HIV positive tests are reportable through surveillance, as are viral loads. So viral loads as a lab measure become a surrogate marker for a visit. If someone has a viral load equals a visit. It's not perfect. You can get one in the emergency room in the hospital, but the idea is that a viral load equals a visit. So if someone has a positive test and there's no viral load in surveillance, it would suggest someone hasn't linked to care. And for us as a healthcare setting, we were able to say, here's the 10% of folks we haven't seen the last 12 months. Do you have viral loads for them? Can you link up with your data to tell us who's really not in care? And we piloted this for the first time earlier this year, and we found out that among our 250, 300 folks who were out of care, only 40% were truly out of care. 135 were in care somewhere else. Some had died and we hadn't heard about it yet, and they couldn't locate some others. But now through this kind of system integration, and again, I think there's other ways to do this. Not everyone has reportable labs like HIV. In some states, there's diabetes registries. You could do this, but by partnering with whether it's public health, insurance companies, other hospital information exchanges, you can kind of better really get a sense for, among those who are lost to follow-up, who's really lost, who's not really lost. And so now our work of trying to reconnect 109 people versus 300 becomes much more manageable, much more doable for us. And what's been really cool is that through the coalition, we're able to receive 2 large CDC projects that have really grown our workforce in terms of frontline providers. So these are community case managers, these are community social workers, linkage coordinators. Not all these folks work on these 2 large CDC grants, but many of them do. These are folks from public health. So we've convened this group the first time last December and then November, and brought together the boots on the ground, the frontline providers, because ultimately that's who's going to determine if we're successful getting folks in care, keeping them in care. And for us as a clinic, very limited outreach for those 109 people to get them back into care. But now through these projects and through these partners, we have folks who are in the community, embedded in the community, to do this outreach and activity to bring folks back into care and extend what we're doing. So in terms of next steps, Data to Care, how are we implementing and where are we going with this? The re-engagement program has been expanded beyond us as the pilot clinic to all the other clinics in the regional quality group. So now we have all 8 clinics throughout the state sharing their data. Here's our loss to care, send it to the health department, get back, here's your active case list to work on. Capturing, reporting on our efforts, and then expanding to linkage to care. And so I want to come back to this case just to kind of close it out where I started. So he came back in to care, started HIV medicine, started chemotherapy. He missed a visit, and the nurse practitioner I work with called him. I was sitting there, Gina Dobbs called him, so what's going on? I need to see you. And then he had improved retention viral suppression, and he still remains in care. So came back in, was in bad shape, got on treatment, missed that visit, came back, and has since been on treatment. It's been a bumpy road. I mean, he's missed some visits, he's been on and off therapy, but I think those personal reminders, personal relationships for him have kept him with us, and more often than not, his virus under control. So just to summarize, in terms of engagement and care, this idea of a treatment cascade, I think if you looked at it for diabetes, as some have, or other conditions, it might not be 50% of folks with the condition are out of care, but it's probably a good number. And these are folks that are traditionally not engaging in the healthcare system that we need to figure out where are they, how do we get them back into care. That's this idea of linkage, retention, re-engagement, distinct steps. I hope I've impressed that missed and kept visit measures are capturing distinct aspects of healthcare engagement. And I think there's huge untapped potential within the healthcare system to study visits. And the beauty of visits is kind of like lab data. They're pretty good quality data in terms of all encounters are captured in software that are linked to billing. So those data tend to be pretty good in terms of if someone arrived, if someone missed. So there's readily available data elements to kind of measure, capture, study this beyond HIV and other health conditions. There are very low cost interventions that you can improve care engagement. So one was this Project Connect. We're now trying to deploy to other HIV clinics, the other intervention for attention and care. But that ultimately community and public health collaborations enhance both the science, I think we're doing better science, but also the service delivery. So coming back to starting with one clinic with 3,000 patients to now engaging all the clinics in the state with 8,000 patients and with community partners to get the remainder of folks not in care has really expanded both what's on the horizons for research, but I think ultimately to improve individual and population health. And so it's really cool. So from that whiteboard 10 years ago where it was just kind of a blank board, we now have this incredible team of engaged community people, both at UAB, but also in the community and across the state. And we have now set ambitious goals that we're going to end AIDS in Alabama in 5 years. And I think that wouldn't have been imaginable 5-10 years ago. So a lot of folks to thank. I can't thank everyone by name at the clinic, the health department, the coalition, the regional quality group, and the CFAR. And this is our research team, Research Informatics Service Center, that James Willig has been my partner in crime the last 10 years. And we've grown from a pretty small group to a large research informatics team and a great administrative team. So thanks so much and happy to take questions.
Hi.
Hey.
I have a question. I get curious about your last case. So you show that patient get missed a visit and then come back to the clinic, and then he's HIV get really good control.
Mm-hmm.
So do you ever do the research about what's the maximum tolerance of their missing the care, to their healthcare management for the HIV patient?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So we've explored that a little bit. One of the challenges in terms of what is the optimal frequency or tolerance or those things is relative to what outcome. So if it's relative to viral load or lab data, typically those measures are tethered to coming in for a visit. So it's kind of hard without that. Those surrogate measures often are missing. They're not missing at random. But relative to a hard outcome like mortality, we've looked at kind of mortality, but not to the degree you're talking about. We've looked at these different measures and shown their association with mortality. Interestingly, even among people that meet the quality indicator for retention and care, there's a dose-response relationship in terms of the more times they've missed, the higher the mortality. But in terms of the tolerance or that kind of a threshold, we haven't done that kind of modeling work.
It was very inspiring.
Thank you.
With respect to the question on the intervention that you conducted, what was the length of that intervention?
So the intervention, the individual level intervention?
Yeah, the individual level.
It lasted for 12 months total.
Okay.
And there was the 2 personal visits that corresponded with clinic visits. So they weren't extra. I mean, it was just kind of a brief interaction.
Right.
And it was amazing, despite our care team, including a physician, a nurse practitioner or ID fellow, a social worker, and a nurse, this extra person, how impactful they were for the participants in the study. I mean, and even after the 12 months and kind of graduating from the study, a lot of them were very sad that this relationship had to end.
Have you followed up after the intervention to see how sustained?
So the CDC has the aggregate data, but hasn't reported on it yet.
Okay.
I can tell you what we've done at the clinic based upon these series of studies is we've used 340B, revenue to hire. We have 4 engagement coordinators. So we actually have 4 people that are now part of our clinic team and have expanded our healthcare team to 5. So now this person that's doing the personal phone calls, missed visit calls is now kind of a new member of the healthcare team, but that's been our implementation plan.
So you've made it standard of care,
Mhm.
sort of.
Great. Well, I want to thank Bugs for a really terrific talk and one that really ties in health systems interventions, the community-based participatory research using health informatics systems. So this is really a great conclusion.